Nishikata was an ugly, disgusting loser, who was content with living like an NPC. However, all that changed when a baddie began teasing him, so he decided the only way to pay her back was to rizz her up. One particular day, while the entire class was paying attention to the ongoing lesson, Nishikata was busy making a jack-in-the-box. When Takagi asked the incomplete bobblehead what he was doing, he told her it was nothing, but she didn't believe him. Nishikata intended to use the jack-in-the-box to scare Takagi, but he noticed her struggling with her pencil case before he could put it all together. He asked what the problem was and she told him the case wouldn't open, saying it must have gotten jammed when it fell. She then handed it over to him and asked if he could open it for her. Nishikata took the case and was surprised to see that it opened easily, but he nearly had a heart attack when something popped out of the case, causing him to scream bloody hell. His courage, the cowardly dog scream, drew the attention of the other students and their teacher, who told him to put a cork in it. Nishikata was so embarrassed, and Takagi kept laughing at him even after he handed her pencil case back to her. Nishikata packed up his failed jack-in-box as he plotted his next move since he wasn't ready to let her have the last laugh. Takagi then asked to borrow his eraser, and after he handed it over to her, she asked if he remembered the old sayings about erasers and crushes. It was believed that writing your crush's name on your eraser and using it all up would guarantee that your feelings became mutual. Nishikata told her he remembered the saying but also said it was the dumbest thing anyone could ever do. Takagi simply hummed as she slowly pulled his eraser out of its covering and examined it. For some reason, Nishikata began to panic as he couldn't remember if he'd written the name of his crush on the eraser. Takagi made it worse by making sounds that made him believe he'd indeed written someone's name on the eraser. Embarrassed, he begged her to return his eraser, so she did, and immediately after he grabbed it and examined it, he realized she'd been messing with him. This made the fool scream in annoyance because she gaslighted him into believing a lie. In a screaming fit, he noticed her eraser on her table and began complaining only to be taken out by a sniper rifle for being too loud. The man told him to shut his pie bowl and threatened to have his mouth sewn shut the next time he disrupted the class with his voice. Nishikata apologized and sat back down feeling more embarrassed than he'd been earlier, so he told Takagi, who was still laughing at his expense, to cut it out. Takagi simply said that he was fun to tease and then asked the teacher for permission to go to the bathroom. As soon as she stepped out, a scheming Nishikata noticed she'd left her eraser on her desk, so he picked it up to write someone's name on it. However, when he began pulling it out, he noticed she'd already written something on it, and he panicked. Curious George, sorry Nishikata became conflicted, because on the one hand, he wanted to know who Takagi had a crush on, and on the other hand, he didn't want to invade her privacy. Eventually, he gave in to his curiosity, but he was too much of a wimp to pull the entire thing out, so he settled for the first letter. The letter read Lo, and the funny part was that this dumb idiot was disappointed that it wasn't his name. However, he convinced himself that it wasn't so and pulled the entire eraser out to find out who the person was. Surprisingly, what was written there wasn't a name, but a message asking him to look at the hallway. The moment he did so, he saw Takagi smiling at him, which shocked him as he couldn't believe she pulled a fast one on him again. She then walked back into the classroom and told him that his shocked face had been a picture-perfect replica of Ghostface, which only added to his embarrassment. Refusing to look at her, Nishikata promised to get his revenge one way or another, and Takagi wished him good luck. The following day, Nishikata went to school very early in the morning since he was on day duty, which he hated. When he got closer to school, he looked up and saw Takagi watching him from the classroom window, which surprised him. When he got to his classroom, he discovered it was as empty as his head, but he was sure Takagi was hiding in the room. Refusing to let his guard down, he looked around the classroom, hoping to find where the Loki wannabe was hiding. He soon discovered her shoes sticking out from underneath the podium and concluded she was trying to scare him. Instead of confronting her, he decided to take another approach and went to sit at his desk, after which he loudly said he was going to do his chores. Nishikata was sure Takagi would become frustrated that her plan failed, and he'd be able to gloat over it when she came out of hiding. The next moment, however, his slow, malfunctioning brain suddenly clicked, and he realized Takagi was way too smart to make such an obvious mistake. This made him get up and search the room for where she might have hidden. After he checked the classroom and the hallway, he figured she was hiding in the cleaning supply closet, so he tipped it over to it and yanked the door open. As expected, it was empty, so he rushed to the podium to confirm his suspension and found only Takagi's shoes. His inability to locate her left him in a daze, so he sat at his desk wondering if his mind had played tricks on him. Suddenly, the curtain was pulled back and Takagi revealed herself, causing Nishikata to scream and fall off his chair. Takagi laughed at his predicament and told him she'd been watching him play Sherlock from behind the curtains. Nishikata wasn't happy that he'd been outsmarted again, but he could only watch Takagi laugh at his expense Eventually, the two sat down at their respective desks, and Takeji told Nishikata that she hoped no one else would arrive. This made Nishikata's cheeks heat up as her words hinted that she enjoyed being alone with him. So he tried to ask if she had a crush on him. Before he could get the words out, their classmates Mina, Yukari, and Sanae walked in, so he lost his nerve. After watching the three girls argue about something, Takeji reminded Nishikata that he had yet to complete his morning chores, so he immediately scrambled to do them. Later that day, while Nishikata was in the boys' bathroom grumbling in front of a mirror about how Takeji never stopped teasing him, Nakai walked in. Nakai assumed he was practicing his funny faces, and when he asked Nishikata about it, a light bulb suddenly came on in his head. While he concentrated on perfecting a funny face, Nakai asked if he had feelings for Takeji since they were always together. Nishikata immediately turned to face him, and Nakai forgot about his question as he burst into laughter. Nishikata soon left the bathroom, feeling as though he just won America's Got Talent, since his so-called funny face had left Nakai in a laughing fit. When class began later, he decided he would get Takeji in trouble with their teacher by making her laugh at his funny face. He patiently waited until Takeji tried to ask him for something before executing his plan. Unfortunately, instead of laughing like he expected her to, Takeji simply opened her compact mirror to show him what he looked like. Nishikata immediately began laughing, drawing the teacher's attention to him and getting himself scolded for disrupting class. After he calmed down, Takeji laughed at him and said his plan as well as his funny face had been unoriginal. She then directed him on how to make a proper funny face and told him that if he turned away from her, his side profile would make her laugh. Nishikata did as she asked and came face to face with their teacher, who screamed at him until he apologized for his behavior. When the teacher left, Takeji burst into laughter, but Nishikata was so embarrassed he refused to take his head off the table. A few days later, they had a calligraphy class, and their teacher asked each of them to write out their favorite words. Takeji suggested to Nishikata that they both write something they wanted from one another, and he agreed. When they were both done writing, they showed each other what they had written. Takeji had written status quo, while Nishikata had written restraint. Takeji asked what kind of restraint he wanted her to exhibit, and he realized he'd failed to get his message across. Since he was way dumber than Shaggy and Scooby put together, he wasn't sure how to explain it to her, so he changed the subject and asked why she'd written status quo. Takeji explained to her dim-witted friend that she'd written that because she wanted things between them to remain the same. That way, he'd remain the unofficial class idiot, while she'd remain the queen of tricks and pranks. Nishikata was very shocked by how much of an evil witch Takeji was proving herself to be, so he decided to up his game and asked that they write something else. This time around, he decided to write the word kindness, so that Takeji would realize she was more of a devil than an angel. However, Takeji, who was unaware of his plans, unintentionally pulled the ultimate reverse move by complimenting his handwriting, which caught him off guard. In his momentary state of shock, he dropped his brush, so she helped him pick it up and handed it back to him, making him question everything he knew about her. While he was lost in thought, she asked him to stay still because he had something on his cheek and wiped it off with her thumb. This was enough to convince Nishikata that even though Takeji teased him, she was a kind-hearted person, so he changed what he wrote down. He settled for telling her to stop teasing him, and Takeji promised to try her best not to after he showed his paper to her. When she showed him what she'd written down, he was surprised to see a message telling him that he had ink on his face. That was when he realized the cunning fox of a girl had put ink on his cheek when she touched him earlier under the pretext of removing something. During English class a week later, the teacher asked Nishikata a question, but since he hadn't been paying attention, he didn't know the answer. Takeji whispered the number 16 to him, and without hesitation, he repeated it to the teacher, who threw a chalk at his head. The man told him they were in English class and not math, so he better get his head out of the clouds and back in class. Nishikata sat back down feeling embarrassed, and Takeji told him she'd said that number to let him know what page they were on, but he didn't believe her. However, he decided to get back at her and try to distract her until it was her turn to answer the teacher's question. And when the teacher finally called her name, Nishikata smirked evilly. This was because he was so sure she had not been paying attention, and that would lead to her getting scolded by him. Surprisingly, Takeji answered the question correctly, and after she sat down, she told Nishikata not to lump her in with his empty-headed self. Nishikata couldn't believe his plan had failed again and started thinking about what to do next. The next day, the class had a swimming lesson, but Nishikata couldn't get in the pool with the others because he had an injured hand. While he sat in the shade lamenting his predicament, Takeji suddenly joined him and asked how he'd gotten hurt. Nishikata just mumbled a few incoherent words, so she'd asked if he'd gotten hurt when he tried to pet a stray cat. He was so surprised by how accurate her guess was that he stupidly asked if she was psychic. Takeji just laughed and told him that she'd only made a wild guess, which his reaction confirmed to be true. Nishikata felt embarrassed, so he tried to change the topic by asking why she wasn't in the pool with the others. Before she could answer, he remembered his friend Takao, who was modeled after a mole rat, had told him that if girls were on their period, they didn't get in the pool. Since Takao had also mentioned that the period caused abdominal pain and Takeji was holding her stomach, Nishikata assumed that was why she was sitting with him. Takeji then asked him to guess the reason she wasn't swimming since she'd guessed his, but he felt it would be awkward saying period, so he declined her request. This made Takeji tell him that she'd won, and since he didn't like losing to her, he summoned the courage to say it, but had to rethink before he could. Nishikata felt Takeji was trying to lead him into a trap, and he didn't like that. He tried to come up with another answer, but he couldn't seem to find any. And when Takeji asked if he had an answer, he said no. She then asked if he was trying to figure out an answer, or just staring at the different plot sizes of their classmates in the pool like a shameless, cultured loser. Nishikata swore he wasn't checking their classmates out, and when he looked in her direction again, a thought crossed his mind. He began to wonder if Takeji wasn't swimming because she was ashamed of her runway chest. However, he knew that saying something like that would be rude, so he went his first option. But Takeji said his answer was wrong and told him it was rude to point stuff like that out to a girl. He then tried to apologize. She simply laughed and then took off her PE to reveal her swimsuit. This made him realize that she had been messing with him, and since he couldn't do anything, he watched as she got into the pool with the others. A few days later, Nishikata was on his way home from school when Takeji rode her bike close to him and suggested they go home together. As they walked, she asked if the juice he was drinking tasted good, so he offered her a sip. Takeji took the can from him and was about to drink from it when Nishikata pointed out that by doing so she was kissing him indirectly. He said this hoping she'd get flustered about the idea of kissing him, but Takeji didn't care. As she drank from the can, Nishikata stared at her with his mouth wide open as he couldn't believe she wasn't bothered. When she gave him back the can, he kept staring at the spot her lips had been, so Takeji asked if he wasn't going to drink from it. He told her he would, and even though he was having an internal breakdown, he schooled his facial expressions and raised the can to his lips, just as he was about to drink from it. Takeji told him he was about to kiss her indirectly, so the never-been-kissed virgin panicked and dropped the can. This made Takeji laugh, but Nishikata said nothing as he picked up the can and tossed it into a nearby trash can. To his surprise, it went in directly, and that made him feel like he was Kuroko. He picked up another can and tossed it into the trash can again. So while he was basking in his new skills, Takeji gave it a shot. Unfortunately, she didn't make the basket and Nishikata mocked her for being a terrible shot, so she proposed they play a game. She said that whoever made the next basket toss would win, and since Nishikata was overflowing with pride, he agreed. He even went as far as saying that if she won, he'd do whatever she wanted him to do without any argument. Takeji agreed to his proposal, and before she tossed the can, told him not to take back his words when he lost the match. When the can went into the trash can, he was surprised but assumed she'd just been lucky. He then picked up another can and was about to toss it when Takeji told him she would give him her first kiss if he won. Her words caused his brain to momentarily short-circuit, and that made him miss the shot. Nishikata fell to his knees in defeat as Takeji laughed and celebrated her victory over him. When they continued on their way, Nishikata couldn't help but wonder what sinister thing she'd make him do since he'd lost. However, Takeji suddenly stopped and told him she didn't mind if he didn't do anything for her, which surprised him. He tried to convince her to give him a task, but she refused, saying there wasn't any need to do so. A little while after Nishikata got home, he decided to do some push-ups as a way to mentally prepare himself for when he met Takeji the next day. Unfortunately, he was no Goku or Vegeta, so his arms gave out after a few push-ups and he fell flat on his face. Still, he refused to give up as he aimed to level up like some Jinwoo and prove to Takeji that he could beat her at her own game. The next day at school, his muscles were sore from all the push-ups he had done the previous day, and when Takeji noticed something was wrong with his arms, she asked about it. He'd assured her that everything was fine, but she didn't believe him and poked him to see if he'd react, which he did. Takeji laughed at his reaction, and when she finally stopped, she asked why he was sore, so he told her he started muscle training the day before. Takeji found it interesting that a lazy ass like Nishikata was working out, and she told him he wouldn't last 3 days. Nishikata just smiled to himself as he swore to prove her wrong, which was why when he got home that evening, he continued his training. A few days later, while he and Takeji walked home together, she asked if he was still doing his muscle training, and he told her yes. Takeji admitted that she'd expected him to give up and commended him for his dedication. However, she told him that if he trained too much during his growth spurt, it would hinder him from growing taller. This freaked Nishikata out because even though he admired Captain Leva, He didn't want to be the same height as he was. He also didn't like the idea of Takagi being taller than him, and was about to say something when she told him not to let her words bother him. She assured him that it was just a rumor, and said it was a good thing he was taking his training seriously, because he was starting to look like her dream man. In response to her statement, Nishikata began blushing so hard, you'd think his face was a heated iron. Takagi noticed this and laughed at him, making him realize she'd been teasing him as usual. The next day, it suddenly began to rain after school, and while Mina complained to her friends about not bringing her umbrella, Nishikata noticed Takagi hadn't moved from her desk. When he asked why she wasn't leaving, she told him she'd left her umbrella at home, and he began laughing. He even threw a few insults at her for being forgetful. But Takagi surprised him by ignoring them and asking him to share his umbrella with her. As they walked home, Nishikata's brain worked overtime because he couldn't help but think about how sharing an umbrella made them look like a couple. To take his mind off it, he tried to strike up a conversation, but it died as soon as it began. While he was thinking of something else to do to make the situation less tense and awkward for him, he noticed a frog sitting on a fence. He then grabbed it and tried to scare Takagi with it, but she took the frog from him and gushed about how cute it looked. This made him wonder if she was the Japanese version of Princess Tiana. But before he could say anything, he noticed she put the frog on his shoulder. Nishikata screamed almost immediately, and Takagi laughed at how scared he was of a harmless frog. As they continued on their way, Takagi noticed Nishikata's right shoulder was getting wet because he was trying to make sure she didn't get wet, so she moved closer to him. This caused Nishikata's heart to begin galloping like a horse, so he tried to calm himself down by talking about random things. Takagi ended up teasing him, but thankfully the rain soon stopped, and he begged her to stop messing with him before they went their separate ways. 2 days later, Nishikata was summoned to the teacher's office because of his recent disturbance during class. After the teacher scolded him, he told Nishikata that he was to clean the science room after school. Nishikata thought the chore was too much for one person to handle, but he didn't complain and went to the science room after school. As he grumbled to himself, he opened the cleaning supply closet and almost became the new colossal titan as he nearly jumped out of his skin in fear. This was because Takagi had hidden in the closet and waited for him to open it before she scared the shit out of him. When he recovered, he asked why she was trying to send him to the pearly white gates before his time, but she just laughed. She then stepped out of the closet so he could pull out the brooms and proposed they play a game to make their chore more fun. Nishikata asked what she had in mind, so she told him they would play rock, paper, scissors, and said that the loser had to clean a quarter of the room alone. Nishikata thought about it and concluded that if he channeled his inner Gon Freaks, he would win the game, so he agreed. Before the game began, Takagi told him she would use rock, and that was enough to throw him into confusion as he wasn't expecting her to do it, so he lost. While he cleaned, Nakai walked by with Mono, and when they noticed Nishikata and Takagi in the room, they stopped to say hello. Nakai asked Nishikata why he was cleaning the science room, and Nishikata explained that it was his punishment for being loud during class. When Nishikata asked why they were still around after school, Nakai and Mono became visibly uncomfortable. However, Nakai recovered quickly and said they were just hanging out before heading home, which Nishikata believed. Mono then suggested they leave Nishikata to complete his chores, so Nakai pushed off the window and bid his friend goodbye. After they walked away, Takagi told Nishikata that Nakai and Mono were a couple, and the dumb fool shouted in surprise. He admitted that he noticed Nakai had been hanging out with Mano a lot, but since he was a clueless noob, he didn't realize it was because they were together. Takagi said she was sure Nakai and Mono were heading to the rooftop to spend time alone, and for some reason, Nishikata's cheeks turned red. Before they left the science room, they played 3 more rounds of rock, paper, scissors, and Nishikata lost all of them, so he ended up cleaning the room alone. As they walked home together, Nishikata complained about the heat, so Takagi suggested they get some drinks. She then proposed that they play a game in which the loser had to pay for the drinks, and Nishikata agreed on the condition that he pick the game. When he spotted some high bars in a playground, he decided that the game would be to perform a kickover on them. He felt very confident that he'd win since he'd randomly done a kickover one day and nailed it. He had felt like an Olympic gold medalist at that moment, so he was determined to show Takagi he was better than her. When Takagi pointed out that she was wearing a skirt, he was glad because he thought she'd forfeit since she couldn't do a kickover with it, but she told him she didn't mind. The only thing she asked was that he look the other way while she was doing it, so his wandering eyes didn't get to see her underwear. Nishikata tried to argue that if he did so, he wouldn't be able to tell if she did the challenge or not, but she told him that he'd lose if he looked, so he kept quiet. Soon after he turned away, Takagi held on to the bar and did the kickover, but Nishikata wasn't convinced she'd done it. That was why after he finished his challenge, he suggested they do it again. Takagi agreed and went first, But Nishikata's curiosity and urge to prove that she was only pretending to do the kickover made him turn around at the last second. He was so shocked to see that she not only did the kickover, but was also wearing shorts underneath her skirt. Quickly, he turned away, acting like he hadn't just broken the one rule she set for the game. Eventually, the guilt got to him, so he told Takagi what he had done and bought the drink after admitting his loss. As she drank her juice, Nishikata asked why she'd made him look away when she had shorts on. Takagi simply looked at him and called him a cultured brat for looking at her in the first place. When she began walking away, he chased after her and tried to explain that his intentions hadn't been impure. But Takagi refused to listen and teased him about it. That night, Nishikata stayed up late watching an anime with his air conditioner on full blast, so he ended up with a cold and couldn't go to school. At school, Takagi kept glancing at his desk while class was going on, and when she finally decided to concentrate, Nishikata walked in. The teacher asked if he was strong enough to be in school, and he assured him that he was, after which he took his seat. When Takagi asked the same question, he did a hair flip that was supposed to make him look irresistible to her and said he was fine. This made her ask if he had spent his night watching the 100% unrequited love anime. Nishikata was shocked that she'd guessed correctly, and was about to ask how she knew when a chalk smacked him in the head. The teacher told him that he was being too loud, so he apologized and sat down as Takagi began to laugh. When she noticed he was coughing, she asked if he was okay, and he assured her that he was, so she carried on with the class. Meanwhile, Nishikata was busy planning to put the plan he came up with while watching the unrequited love anime the night before. His plan was simple: strike a pose that was sure to get Takagi's heart racing when she laid eyes on him. But it didn't work. Takagi didn't say a word to him, and began to wonder if his non-existent rizzing abilities were failing him. When he looked at her, he was suddenly very aware of her facial features and felt his heart beginning to race. Realizing that he was starting to see her differently, Nishikata immediately tried to get rid of those intrusive thoughts. Takagi noticed he'd gone red in the face, so she asked if he was having a fever, and he told her no. However, since his face was still bright red, she kept insisting he tell her if something was wrong with him. Nishikata assured her that he was fine and even said he'd been lying about his cold because he was sure her niceness was all a lie. This made her tell him she was glad he felt okay, as she could now tease him to her heart's content, which she did to his annoyance. Some days later after school, Mina insisted her friends follow her to a snack shop so she could buy a baked sweet potato-flavored ice pop. As they got closer to the shop, Yukari stopped walking, and when her friends asked why, she pointed at the shop, saying Nishikata and Takagi were there. Yukari was about to suggest they go elsewhere, because she thought Takagi and Nishikata were on a date. But Mina grabbed Sanai's arm and ran towards the shop. After Mina got her ice pop, and the friends bid Takagi and Nishikata farewell, Yukari said they were lucky to have each other. Her friends asked what she was talking about, so she pointed out that Nishikata and Takagi were in a relationship, but they didn't believe her. To prove she was right, she suggested they follow the unsuspecting duo, but since none of them had paid attention during stealth class at military boot camp, Takagi noticed them almost immediately. She then suggested to Nishikata that they take another route, and when the girls tried to follow them, they discovered that, just like the avatar, Nishikata and Takagi had disappeared. Yukari wondered if they had noticed they were being followed, but when Mina started complaining, she agreed to go back. Unknown to them, Nishikata and Takagi had hidden next to a pole covered by bushes, which was why they didn't see them. After Takagi confirmed the coast was clear, they came out of hiding and continued on their way home. A week later, Nishikata's friends left him in the library, since he refused to go play with them when they all got tired of studying. Nishikata felt jealous, but since he knew he was as dumb as the Three Stooges, he pushed the thoughts aside and kept studying. Just then, Takagi appeared out of nowhere and asked if she could sit with him. After she sat down, she asked why he wasn't going out to play with his friends, so he told her that if he failed the tests, his parents would take away his video games. When he realized he'd overshared, he panicked, thinking she would try to do something to interfere with his studying. This made him tell her not to disturb him, and even though Takagi agreed, she still told him teasing him was fun. A few minutes later, he noticed the book she was reading wasn't a school book, so he asked why she wasn't studying. She told him she had already studied for the day, as she always made sure to study for 2 hours every day, which he thought was impressive. However, he couldn't help but feel like the sneaky girl had something planned for him, and it made him worried. When Takagi noticed he was staring at her, she asked if he was staring because he'd fallen hopelessly in love with her, making him blush as he turned his head away. Realizing his actions made him look like a certified simp, he tried to set the record straight, but she cut him off and pointed out that he'd gotten the equation he was solving wrong. When he tried to figure out where he'd gone wrong, she moved her chair closer to him and explained it to him. Nishikata was glad he was getting tutored by Albert Einstein's protege, but he began to wonder if there was another reason why she was helping him. So he asked what she wanted in return. Tekeji told him she was only helping him because she was well aware that his IQ was in the negative zone and she didn't want to watch him fail. That evening, as they made their way home, Nishikata thanked Takagi for tutoring him and said because of her, he wasn't going to fail. However, she told him that what she taught him wasn't going to come out in the test, which surprised him. When the day of the test finally arrived, Mina and Sanae begged Yukari to review their English course with them since they always struggled with it. Yukari told them she couldn't as she needed to focus on a review since she'd been promised a new video game if she scored above 90. Mina couldn't believe a video game was more important to Yukari than helping them study for a test, but Yukari didn't care. She shooed them away like they were some pesky flies and ignored their complaints about her heartless decision as she studied. However, when the teacher arrived with the next test papers, Yukari's confidence meter went from 100 to 0 as the test wasn't English, but math. Later on, when the teacher returned with the marked scripts, he began sharing them back to the students, and when it was Takagi's turn, he praised her for a job well done. Yukari, on the other hand, had scored lower than she expected. After Takagi returned to her seat, Nishikata's name was called, and he was surprised that he'd gotten an average score. As he sat down, he blamed Takagi in his mind for misleading him with her tutoring, refusing to acknowledge the fact that he failed because he was as dumb as a doorknob. He was so lost in his internal blame game that it took a while for him to realize Takagi had been calling him. When he finally heard her, she suggested they try to guess each other's score, so he agreed. Takagi went first and guessed that she scored between 50 and 59, which surprised him, but he tried to keep a poker face so she wouldn't realize she was close to the truth. However, she settled for 56, and almost immediately, the idiot got up and showed her his script, bragging that she'd failed to guess correctly. The next moment, he got hit in the head with a chalk and the teacher told him to stop showcasing the proof that his brain went out of commission a long time ago. Ashamed, he sat back down and Takagi asked him to guess what her score was, saying if he was off by 2 points, he would win. Since the teacher had praised her earlier, Nishikata figured her score was above 90, so he decided to call numbers in that wrong day and watch her reaction. The first number he called was 92, and to his surprise, Takagi looked shocked, but he assumed she was trying to mislead him. In the end, he went with 97 and was greatly disappointed when she showed him her script with the number 92 written bodily on it. That weekend, Nishikata went to the bookstore to buy the latest issue of the Unrequited Love manga and quickly put it in his backpack because he didn't want anyone to find out he read shoujo manga. Unfortunately, it seemed like the plot gods were working overtime to ensure that his secret was discovered, because as soon as he stepped out of the store, he met Takagi. She told him she was out on a walk and asked what book he'd bought at the store, which made him freak out. At first, he thought of telling her he didn't buy anything, but after considering that she might have seen him paying at the counter, he told her he'd bought a soccer manga. He assumed telling her that would throw her off, but Takagi surprised him by asking to see the manga, so he came up with different reasons why he couldn't show it to her. When he began walking away, Takagi followed him and insisted they walk home together. As they walked, Takagi asked if he'd bought the Unrequited Love manga, which shocked him. Nishikata asked how she knew, and she admitted she'd seen him buy it while she was standing outside, making him realize she'd been messing with him all along. He then begged her not to let anyone know about his secret, else he'd become the laughingstock of the entire school. Takagi promised to take his secret to infinity and beyond, to the grave, but Nishikata was skeptical as she agreed way too quickly. To make him feel more at ease and trust her with his secret, she offered to tell him her secret. She then leaned in and whispered into his ear that she liked him, causing him to freak out as his face slowly resembled a tomato. Takagi laughed at his shocked expression and told him she'd lied to him as payback for him lying to her about the manga. The following week, Takagi and Nishikata took shelter in a shrine when it began to rain all of a sudden as they walked home. Nishikata noticed Takagi's shirt was soaked through and making her innerwear visible, so he quickly looked away, hoping she hadn't noticed him staring. However, he still wasn't okay with just looking away, so he began talking about the anime he wanted to watch when he got home. Takagi teased him for his obsession with the Unrequited Love series, but he swore it wasn't an obsession and reminded her that she promised never to speak of it. She told him it didn't matter since no one else was around, and he agreed with her. She then went to pull out her PE shirt from her bag so she could change out of her wet clothes and discovered it was slightly wet. This made her ask Nishikata for his PE shirt, and while she changed, he did his best not to turn into his other personality, Tom the Peeper. When she was done, she made a bet with him that the rain would stop when the town clock struck 5. Nishikata told her that it wouldn't, but she told him that if it did, he would have to do whatever she wanted, and he agreed. While they waited, a stray cat approached them, and when Takagi tried to touch it, Nishikata warned her that it could scratch her. The next moment, it shook its body to get rid of all the water, and Nishikata ended up with a wet shirt. Takagi offered her PE shirt to him, and before he put it on, he sniffed like a creep. Most likely because he wanted to commit her smell to his memory for when he decided to pull out his favorite sock later that night. Eventually, the rain stopped like Takagi said it would, and since the bet was that he had to do whatever she wanted, she asked him to go somewhere with her. A few days later, as they walked home, Nishikata happily talked about all the fun he intended to have during the summer holiday. Somewhere along the way, they spotted Nakai and his girlfriend riding home together on his bike, and for some reason, Nishikata suddenly went quiet. When Takagi noticed he was quiet, she asked if he wanted to give tandem riding a try, and he immediately refused. His reason was that they might get hit by the Isekai Avenger truck queue, and he wasn't ready to become an adventurer. Takagi pointed out that they weren't near any major roads, so his reason made no sense. Still, he refused, so she asked if he was embarrassed to be seen riding a bike with her, since she was way out of his league. Nishikata assured her that the one thing he could never measure up to was her large forehead, and asked her not to flatter herself because she wasn't all that. Takagi just smiled and suggested they go to a vacant lot to give the tandem riding a try. When they got there, Takagi made a deal with him that if he failed to do it, he'd have to buy her a can of juice. Nishikata did his best but struggled to make the bike move as he always forgot to train his legs during his workout sessions. When he blamed her for his inability to paddle properly, Takagi said that the last time she'd ridden tandem with a guy, things had gone smoothly. This made him a bit jealous, so he began paddling harder than before because he wanted to prove he was better than whoever took her riding before. As he paddled, Takagi told him that the person she'd been referring to was her dad, and all of a sudden, Nishikata lost control of the bike. Since he lost the bet, he got her a can of juice, and when he tried to do the same for himself, he realized he was broke. When Takagi asked why he didn't get one as well, he told her he didn't want one, refusing to admit he was no better than a poor church rat. Takagi then offered him her can, but he refused to take it, opting to endure the heat until he got home. Thankfully, Takagi had Mother Theresa's heart, so she got him another can when she noticed he was sweating. After they were done drinking their juice, Takagi suggested they meet at the lot every day to practice riding in tandem until noon, and Nishikata agreed. Unfortunately, the next day, it rained throughout the morning, and everyone was stuck indoors. By noon, the rain stopped falling, so Takagi and Nishikata met at the empty lot, just like they agreed to. Since the lot was filled with puddles, Takagi suggested they go somewhere else and hang out since they couldn't ride in the puddles. After Nishikata agreed, Takagi took him to an old abandoned tunnel and suggested a test of courage. She said there were rumors that something lived in the tunnel, and anyone who entered the tunnel was spirited away. Nishikata was visibly terrified, but because he didn't want to be featured in the newest edition of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, he told Takagi he wasn't. As they made their way into the tunnel, Takagi pointed out the paper talisman on the wall and said it was proof that something evil lived in the tunnel. The sound of water dropping somewhere in the tunnel caused Nishikata to scream, and Takagi teased him for it. She then pointed to an empty barrel and asked him to look inside to see if something was hiding in it. Nishikata tried to refuse, but when she called him a spineless coward, he stopped arguing and looked inside the barrel. As soon as he did so, Takagi suddenly screamed, and when he flinched in fear, she started laughing. However, when he turned around to scold her, she was nowhere to be found, and that intensified the fear he was feeling. He began calling out her name, but Takagi didn't respond, so he got scared that she'd been snatched by the spirit. The next moment, someone tapped his shoulder, and when he turned around, he came face to face with Takagi, which caused him to scream. Takagi asked why he was scared, but he told her he wasn't and said he'd just been testing out his vocal range. Before they made their way out of the tunnel, Takagi pointed to a hole in the wall, and since Nishikata didn't want her to make a fool of him again, he decided to play a trick on her. He placed his hand inside the hole and began to scream for help, saying something was pulling on it. But when Takagi didn't rush to his aid, he turned to look at her. He was greeted with the sight of her, causing him to scream. A few days later, Nishikata was on his way to buy groceries when he noticed someone that resembled Takagi. After confirming that she was the one, he began following her, hoping to find something to use against her. When Takagi turned a corner, she glanced at him, and he began to wonder if she'd noticed he was following her. However, when he noticed the tip of her hat peeking out from beside the wall, he assumed she was trying to scare him and decided to counter her. To his surprise, he found only her hat, which she'd placed on the wall as a decoy. And just as he began to wonder where she was, Takagi jumped out of the bushes and scared him. She then asked where he was headed, and he told her grocery shopping, so she suggested they go together. When she turned to collect her hat, she got spooked by a flying bug and nearly lost her footing. Nishikata tried to play Superman, but ended up falling instead, scraping his knee in the process. Takagi suggested they go to the park and wash it off, and after he did, she handed him her handkerchief to tie it up. After that, they began playing with the water, and splashing it on themselves because Takeji said it was fun. That weekend, Nishikata went to the mall to buy the latest issue of Unrequited Love, and after he walked out of the store, he ran into the bane of his existence, Takagi. Knowing she was going to ask about the book he bought, he quickly asked what she was doing at the mall, and she told him she came to buy a swimsuit. Her words left Nishikata speechless, and he stared at her like a mindless zombie until she asked what type of swimsuit he liked. The question caught him off guard, but he managed to recover quickly and told her that he didn't care about swimsuits. This made Takeji tease him, so he tried to leave but stopped in his tracks when she asked if she could borrow the new issue of the Unrequited Love manga he just bought. Nishikata was shocked and swore to himself that Takeji was either a witch or a government spy. Refusing to let her see that he'd been caught off guard by her request, Nishikata told her that she was wrong about the manga he purchased. She then asked what he bought, and he told her it was a manga about robot zombies, hoping that would stop her from asking too many questions. However, Takagi still insisted that he bought the Unrequited Love manga, so he came up with a plan to get her to back off. He told her that if she could guess the manga correctly, he would do anything she asked of him, and she agreed. Since Nishikata had the mental ability of a toddler, he assumed Takagi would forfeit the challenge if he acted like she was wrong. As expected, Takagi didn't fall for his cheap trick and stood by her first choice, so he had no choice but to show the manga to her. Takagi cheered happily once she confirmed she'd been right, but that only made Nishikata aware of the fact that he was way more stupid than he initially thought. Feeling embarrassed, he tried to leave, but she stopped him and reminded him of the deal they made earlier. Nishikata then asked what she wanted him to do, and she told him he had to accompany her to buy a swimsuit. At the store, Nishikata felt so uncomfortable and embarrassed that he refused to look at the swimsuits, even though his cultured mind was singing for joy. Takeji told him to stop acting like a prude and asked him to help her pick one so they could leave. The first one she showed to him was a two-piece, and Nishikata told her it looked nice without bothering to look at it properly. Takeji then stepped into the dressing room so she could try on the swimsuit, and all Nishikata could do was try to distract himself from the fact that she was undressed. The next moment, Takeji came back out dressed in the swimsuit and asked Nishikata if she could pass as a Victoria's Secret model. Nishikata became red in the face and told her not to delude herself, so she decided to put on another swimsuit. When he tried to complain, she told him that she'd keep trying on swimsuits until he said she looked good. Nishikata had no idea why she wanted him to say something so cheesy, and just as he was thinking about it, she poked her head out and asked him to hand her another swimsuit. After he picked one up, his wandering mind couldn't help but wondered if Takeji was dressed or not. As soon as he handed her the swimsuit, he got his answer because the curtain fell and Takagi's body came into view. At first, he was shocked, but when he realized she was fully clothed, he thanked his stars. Takagi then closed the curtains again, and Nishikata got annoyed that she'd toyed with his mind. Just as he prayed he didn't run into any of his classmates, he spotted Nakai and Mano on the other side of the store. A little while later, Takeji opened the curtain to ask for Nishikata's opinion, but she was surprised to see Mano and Nakai standing there instead. Mano spoke to her excitedly, but Nakai was a bit embarrassed, so he turned away slightly even though Mano complained. While the couple spoke to one another, Takeji noticed Nishikata's flip-flops in front of the other dressing room, and the moment Mano saw what she was looking at, she insisted on leaving. As soon as they left, Takeji pulled the curtain of Nishikata's dressing room back and let him know that the coast was clear. When he stepped out, she told him that he had to pick a swimsuit he liked so they could leave. She said she knew he was feeling embarrassed and didn't want anyone to see him in the store for fear that they would think he was a degenerate lowlife. Nishikata denied it, but Takeji knew it was a lie, so she ignored it and began showing him different swimsuits, asking which he liked best. Just as she expected, he said yes to every swimsuit she showed him, and since he kept acting like a pre-recorded message, she decided to take advantage of him. After she'd shown him all the swimsuits, she asked if he wanted to go swimming with her, and he said yes without thinking. When he realized what he'd said, he was shocked, but Takagi just told him it would be a date. A few days later, after Takeji and Nishikata finished practicing their tandem riding, Takeji suggested they go to the library and do their homework. Nishikata tried to refuse, but as soon as she said she'd let him copy her homework, he agreed. However, he pointed out that they didn't have enough time to run home and get their books before heading to the library. Takeji told him not to worry and said they could study at his house instead. When they got there, Takeji suggested they make use of his bed, since he had only one desk and no foldable tables. Almost immediately, the dirty-minded sock lover assumed she wanted to play Find the Rabbit Hole. Thankfully, Takeji explained to the insult-brained idiot that if they took the cover off, they could use the bed as a table. Before they began studying, he asked if she would stick to her promise and let him copy her work, and she told him yes. The only problem was that she only had her kanji textbook with her, and Nishikata called her a heartless witch, but she just laughed. A little while after they began studying, both of them reached for the eraser at the same time. The moment their hands touched, Nishikata remembered a scene from the Unrequited Love series, which started that way but ended in a steamy way. He began freaking out that something like that would happen between him and Takagi, but she diffused the situation by apologizing to him for trying to grab his eraser. Embarrassed, he rushed out to get her a drink, claiming the weather was too hot. Later on, after they finished their homework, Takagi thanked him for having her over and then took her leave. A few days before school resumed for the new term, Nishikata and Takagi were practicing their tandem riding in the vacant lot. Before they began, Nishikata instructed Takagi to hang on tightly, so she put her arms around him slightly. As he began paddling, he remembered the first time Takagi had tried to hold on to him while he was paddling. The movement had been so sudden and unexpected that he freaked out and nearly crashed. He scolded Takagi for tickling him, so she explained that she wasn't and pointed out that he had ticklish ribs. Nishikata tried to play it off and told her to change the way she held on to him, so she tried again. But he told her not to hold his stomach. He tried to get her to hold his shoulder, but she noticed he was red in the face and asked if he was feeling self-conscious. Pinocchio, sorry Nishikata, told her it was because the weather was hot and having her so close made things worse. Takagi then got off the bike and asked him to demonstrate how he wanted her to hold on to him without tickling him or making him overheat. Nishikata got on the back of the bike as she sat in front and shyly held onto her shoulder because he was feeling a bit awkward about their position. In the present, he was more confident and rode the bike like a pro until Takagi said they didn't need to meet up again since they had mastered tandem riding. He had to stop so they wouldn't crash, and Takagi asked if he was bummed out about not spending time with her. Nishikata admitted that he was, and when he asked if she felt the same way, she told him that she didn't, which made him sad. However, he knew she was just teasing him, and when they finished practicing, she suggested they meet up at the library to complete their assignments. Days later, school resumed, and as Nishikata made his way to school, a strong typhoon wind blew. Since he'd watched one too many Harry Potter movies, the idiot stood in the middle of the street with his arms stretched out while he pretended he was the one creating and controlling the wind. The next moment, he noticed Takagi watching him, and he was sure he resembled a crazy cuckoo, standing there with his arms raised, so he put his arms down. When she got closer to him, he told her he was checking the direction of the wind. Takagi then teased him by reenacting the scene she'd witnessed a few seconds ago, making him feel like a fool. When she was done, she asked if he noticed anything different about her, and he said she wasn't with her bike. Takagi then told him that if he correctly guessed why she wasn't riding her bike, she wouldn't tell anyone about his failed attempt at sorcery. Nishikata knew it was because it was dangerous to ride a bike during a typhoon, but he also considered the fact that it was something else. After thinking about it for a while, he concluded that it was because the wind was too strong for her to ride her bike wearing a skirt. When he told her, she told him the correct answer was the first option he thought of, and he looked genuinely surprised, like it wasn't very obvious. A few days later, their class prepared for a marathon, and Kimura noticed how enthusiastic Nishikata was, so he asked why. Before Nishikata could answer, Takagi walked over and asked Nishikata if he was sure he wanted to race against her, and he told her that he was. After she walked away, Kimura asked if he was dating Takagi, and Nishikata told him not to be absurd before walking away angrily. When the race began, Nishikata maintained a specific pace and kept his mind clear so he could focus on winning. He was sure he would win because he'd trained for days and didn't stop even when the weather was bad. The grin he wore on his face could rival that of the Grinch, and when Takagi got closer to him, he did his best to avoid her taunting. However, when she told him she'd been moving at a slower pace because she wanted to give him a head start, the stupid idiot took the bait and sped up. Takagi then told him that if he could touch her shoulder, she would accept that he had won, but Nishikata couldn't do it since he didn't want people to think bad about him. Refusing to give up, he told her that if she could run 50 meters ahead of him, she would win. This was because he hoped she would get tired and eventually give up on the race, making him the winner by default. When she agreed, he was so happy. But all that changed when he discovered that girls turned back once they reached a certain point in the route. After school, as Takagi and Nishikata walked home, Takagi poked his ribs, causing him to flinch and her to laugh at him. This made him propose that whoever laughs first would have to do anything the other person asked of them, and she agreed. Nishikata was sure he had the advantage since Takagi had to push her bike with both of her hands. However, she told him that poking her wouldn't work because she wasn't ticklish, and told him to poke her if he didn't believe. Suddenly, she poked him, and he had to hold in his laughter. But as they continued on their way, he had a hard time deciding whether to poke her. When Takagi noticed his hesitation, she told him if he didn't do it, she would like him again. Before he could respond, she made a funny face, which had him laughing and holding his stomach. This made her say she won the bet, and since he was obligated to do anything she asked as the loser, She told him to poke her. Nishikata hesitated, but she assured him that everything was fine, and when he poked her, he was surprised to see that she'd been telling the truth. They then continued on their way, and Takeji told him that even though her ribs weren't ticklish, her armpits were. At that moment, Nishikata was sure she was messing with him, because there was no way in hell he was going to touch her armpits. A few days later, Nishikata got a new iPhone ripoff, and he was very excited to show it off at school the next day. When he got to school the next day, he collected the emails of his friends and handed the phone over to Takagi when she asked to see it. He assumed she would ask for his email address after handing the phone back to him, but when she didn't, he was disappointed. His mood remained the same for the rest of the day, and by the time they were walking home, he couldn't help but wonder why she hadn't asked for his email. He was very disturbed because he knew that his plan to tease her wouldn't work unless he had her email. Eventually, the slow-brained airhead realized he could have saved himself all the trouble if he had asked her for the email address in the first place. Not wanting to sound like some desperate, Rizzless loser, Nishikata then decided to weasel his way into asking for her email. When he finally asked, Takeji teased him, saying he just wanted an excuse to talk to her at home, after which she exchanged emails with him. Before they parted, she asked if he would join her for cleaning duty the next week, and he agreed. The following week, Nishikata joined Takagi for her cleaning duty, just like he promised he would. And while they cleaned the board, she noticed he looked tired. This made her ask if he had stayed up late chatting with his friends, and he told her yes. So she said she understood what it was like to be addicted to chatting. She told him that the first time she got a phone, she always stayed up late chatting, and Nishikata asked who the person she always chatted with was. She told him it was someone he didn't know, but he kept asking who the person was. So she told him that if he told her what he and his friends were discussing that kept him up all night, she would tell him. Nishikata decided to use the chance to tease her, so he shared the link to the scary goat video Kimura had sent to him the night before. After Takagi received the link, she opened it and then showed him her phone, asking if he enjoyed looking at such things. The picture on her phone of a woman in only her underwear, and Nishikata immediately denied he'd sent it. He swore he wasn't some cultured lecher who got off from viewing photos like that, and Takagi said she believed him, making him realize she'd been messing with him. Takagi then opened the correct link, and after she watched the video, she told him it wasn't so scary since she watched it during the day. Nishikata wasn't happy his plan failed, but his curiosity to find out who she spent time chatting with was greater than his disappointment, so he asked her to tell him. Takagi drew the answer out for a while, making him believe it was a male student from another class until she told him it was her cousin. That night, after his daily push-ups, he decided to send an even scarier video to Takagi, but she called him before he could do so. When he picked up, she asked if he was planning to send her a scary video, and he denied it because he didn't want her to feel like she had been right. Takagi then told him she was about to go to bed and said that speaking to him on the phone made her heart flutter a little. After they talked for a little while longer, Takagi said goodnight to him, but didn't hang up the phone, so he asked why. She said it was because she'd been the one who called, so it was his duty to hang up the call. Nishikata didn't want to, so she suggested they both hang up at the count of 2, but in the end, none of them did. Takagi teased Nishikata, saying he didn't want to hang up because he liked listening to the sound of her voice, and once she was sure he was feeling embarrassed, she laughed and hung up the phone. The next day, as they walked home, Nishikata spotted 2 street cats fighting on top of a nearby fence, so he rushed to capture the moment. Unfortunately, he was too slow and ended up with a picture of the wall instead, so Takagi told him never to dream of becoming a National Geographic wild photographer. When she asked why he was suddenly interested in taking pictures, he told her he and his friends were competing to see who could take the best pictures. He showed her a picture of Kimura in a costume and said none of them had been able to beat him. Takagi then suggested he take a funny picture, so he begged her to make one of her famous funny faces so he could take a photo of it. Takagi responded saying she would only let him if he agreed to do anything she asked him to do. Nishikata couldn't help but wonder what the crazy girl had in mind as they walked. Suddenly, she stopped, and when he looked at her, she was making a funny face, which had him laughing in a matter of seconds. When she resumed walking, she said he missed a chance to take a photo, so he tried to get her to make another funny face. Takagi refused, so he decided to play the guilt card. But it didn't work, as she scared the shit out of him with a toy snake. His reaction made her laugh, and she told him she'd taken pictures so she could remember what he looked like scared. Nishikata insisted she delete the photos, but Takagi refused and began laughing as she went through them. Seeing how carefree she was, he decided to take a photo of her, but at the last second, Takagi posed properly, so the picture turned out nice. Defeater Nishikata said he'd delete the picture if she deleted his, but she refused and said he could keep the picture. When she began walking in the direction of her house, she turned around and told him not to show the picture to anyone because it was embarrassing. Nishikata looked at it one final time and decided he could save it for future blackmail. A few weeks later, Nishikata was so lost in his thoughts that he accidentally ran into a pole and apologized to it, because he didn't notice it was a pole at first. Just then, Takagi pulled up beside him on her bike, and he prayed she hadn't witnessed his embarrassing moment. As they walked to school, Takagi didn't act like she'd seen what happened, but she did ask if he wanted to tandem ride to school. Nishikata told her no because he didn't want to give people the wrong idea, but Takagi teased him for looking embarrassed. As they continued walking, she pointed out that he'd gotten taller as his uniform seemed to fit him better than when he first got it. Nishikata looked at his sleeves and realized she was right, so began bragging about his growth spurt, saying Takagi hadn't changed a bit. This made Takagi say he was harassing her, so he quickly explained that he hadn't been referring to her underdeveloped plots. However, Takagi told him she was referring to her height and told him to clean his garbage-filled mind up. Takagi then told him that the only way to find out if she'd grown taller was for them to check. Instead of heading to school, they stopped at the shrine, and after taking off their shoes, they stood with their backs to one another. While Takagi was trying to measure their correct heights, Nishikata was busy enjoying the warmth her body was providing him. Eventually, he focused on what she was saying, and he heard her say they were the same height, but he didn't believe her and said she was lying. Takagi told him to check for himself, and even though he confirmed it, he accused her of standing on her tiptoes. This made her move and stand in front of him, so he could see for himself whether or not she was telling the truth. Her sudden closeness caught him off guard, but he managed to compose himself. Finally, he took the measurement and realized he was taller than her by a few inches. Takagi said it was because she had indeed been standing on her tiptoes earlier on, and he called her a dirty liar. She told him she didn't mind being shorter because at least she could see where she was going and didn't bump into poles. Nishikata tried to defend himself, but Takagi left no room for him to, so he had no choice but to follow her like a lost puppy. When they got to school and began making their way to class together, they had no idea Mina, Sanae, and Yukari were watching them from behind a wall. The girls found it weird that they arrived together, and Yukari told her friends she was sure they were dating. Later on, while they were in the toilet, Yukari kept talking about Takagi and Nishikata. So Sanae asked if she was jealous of the relationship. She swore that she wasn't and said that she was only curious because of how close they were. When Takagi returned to class, she found Nishikata smirking like an idiot and asked what he was thinking about. He told her it was nothing and prayed she wouldn't discover that he was planning something for when they walked home. As if she read his mind, Takagi asked if he wanted to walk in with her, and because the question caught him off guard, he hesitated. She then told him to take his time and said he could give her an answer by the time classes ended instead. A little while later, Nishikata left the classroom and was stopped by Takao and Kimura, who invited him to play video games with them after school. Nishikata told them he couldn't since he already had plans, and Takao asked if it was with his girlfriend. The question was surprising to him, and even more so when Takao said Takagi was his girlfriend. Before he could tell his friends they were wrong, Mena spoke up from behind him and said Takagi told them she wasn't dating Nishikata. After she walked away, Takao and Kimura asked Nishikata why he was going home with Takagi, and he said it was because she asked him to. They then asked why she wanted to spend time with an ugly-ass NPC like him, and since he didn't know how to respond, he kept quiet. When school was over, Takagi told him that their classmates assumed she was hopelessly in love with him, even though he resembled Lord Farquaad. This was because she was always the one asking him to do stuff with her. Realizing that she looked like a desperate hoe to their classmates, he shyly invited her to walk home with him. On their way home, they stopped by a vending machine to buy some juice, but all the good flavors were sold out. Still, Nishikata thought it would be a good idea to buy one and retreated it after he took a sip. As they continued on their way, he asked Takagi if she'd rather drink a disgusting juice or a tasty one that would give her a fever. He asked this hoping she would pick the former, and that way he'd make her drink the horrible juice he bought. To his surprise, Takagi picked the tasty juice, saying she didn't mind the fever as long as he came to visit her. Still refusing to give up, he asked to choose between never receiving a monthly allowance or never teasing him again. Takagi told him she could do without the allowance until she got a part-time job as she had savings, but said teasing him was her life. She then asked if he'd rather want her to disappear forever or continue teasing him. Nishikata told her he'd accept her teasing any day because he didn't want her to disappear since they were friends. This made her say he picked the second option because he'd miss her if she ever left. The last question she asked was for him to choose between getting 0 points on all his exams for life or kissing her. At the mention of kissing, he began to freak out. But he also knew it would be stupid to pick the first option because he was scared of kissing a girl. In the end, he chose the kissing option, and when she looked in his direction, he assumed she was going to kiss him and freaked out again. However, she told him she was only checking to see who was taller, and he told her to stop teasing him. Days later, Takagi met Nishikata standing on the street with a disappointed look on his face because he had been unable to pet a cat. As they walked, he thanked his stars that she hadn't seen him petting the cat, as that would have made him seem weird. However, when she spotted her neighbor's cat and pointed it out, his head nearly fell off because of how fast he turned it. When she began petting the cat, he got jealous because he had never successfully petted a cat before, but his pride refused to let him ask Takagi to let him have a go. Even when she asked if he wanted to let the cat, he told her it was an unmanly thing to do, but she asked if he was just scared of getting scratched. Seeing the question as an opportunity, he told her that he could prove he wasn't scared by letting the cat right there, but instead of letting him do so, she told him she believed he wasn't scared. The shocked look on his face made her laugh, but she was kind enough to ask if he wanted to let the cat. When he finally admitted he wanted to, she told him the cat had already run off and wished him luck for the next time he saw a cat. Later on at school, during art class, their teacher paired them up and asked them to draw a portrait of one another. Takagi and Nishikata were paired up, and Nishikata, who was far from being the next Evensi, complained about it. He tried his best not to look directly at Takagi, but when she started laughing, he felt self-conscious. However, when he remembered he'd checked himself in the mirror before the class, he concluded she was messing with him as usual. Still, he was a little self-conscious since he was well aware that his face was so ugly that kids cried every time they saw him. To make himself feel better, he decided to draw Takagi way uglier than him. When he overheard Mina telling Yukari that the drawing she made of her was the way she envisioned her, he decided that if Takagi complained, he'd tell her the same thing. By the time he was finished, he showed the portrait to Takagi, and even though he made her look like a cheap knockoff of Eren as the Attack Titan, Takagi didn't get mad at him. Instead, she made a funny face and told him that if he wanted to draw her that way, he had to take a closer look. Nishikata took the drawing back and began examining her face closely so he could correct it. However, it seemed that he looked too closely because his heart began to beat faster as he was suddenly made aware of how pretty Takagi looked. The spell was soon broken when Takagi showed him the portrait she'd drawn. He was very surprised to see that she'd captured most of his features, and when she added the red on his cheeks to indicate blushing, he complained that she'd gotten it wrong. The next day, Takagi and some of their other classmates gathered around a girl reading tarot cards so they could get their fortunes read. When Takagi noticed Nishikata walking past the class, she rushed out and asked him to play rock, paper, scissors with her. Nishikata thought she was up to no good, but she swore that she wasn't and even promised to help with his cleaning duty if he won, so he agreed to play with her. Surprisingly, he won, and that made him feel like he was on cloud 9 because it was the first time he had ever beaten Takagi at anything. Since he'd won, she kept her promise to help him clean, and while they were doing so, she asked if he believed in fortunes. He said he didn't, but was curious to find out why she was asking, and she told him that she had gotten her love fortune read. She said the fortune had said she would do well with her current crush, which surprised him as he didn't think she had a crush on anyone. When she asked if he had a crush, he denied it, but she said she'd also done a live reading for him, and the fortune was the same as hers. This freaked him out, and he began to question whether or not he had a crush on her, because being so close to her made his heart race. He then changed the topic and asked what other readings she did. She said she asked about his choice for the rock, paper, scissors game, and Nishikata started talking about how the so-called fortune had been wrong since he won. Takagi told him it had been accurate, making him realize she'd purposely lost so he would feel good about himself. The next day, Nishikata came to school with a sword in his step, and when he walked into class, he greeted Takagi happily. Before he could explain why he was acting like he ate rainbows for breakfast, Takagi told him she knew he was happy because his horoscope had said he'd have a lucky day. He was surprised she knew but refused to let that deter him, as he believed the time had finally come for him to repay her for all her teasing. However, by the time school ended, Takagi had teased him 50 times, and he wasn't happy that nothing changed despite his horoscope readings. Takagi told him to cheer up as she reminded him that the day wasn't over yet, after which she asked him to walk home with her. Nishikata accepted her invitation because he hoped he could achieve his goal as they walked home. Before they left the school premises, two boys asked Nishikata if he wanted to come over and play games with him, and he said no. On her way home, Takagi asked why he'd refused the invitation to play games, and he told her it was because he wanted to walk home with her. His honesty caught Takagi off guard, so she stopped walking, and when he noticed she wasn't beside him, he freaked out. This was because he believed what he'd said was inappropriate, so he started trying to explain what he meant. Takagi just stared at him, and that made him feel embarrassed, so he begged her to pretend like she hadn't heard him say anything. Takagi said she would do so if he repeated the words, but he refused and ran off. Takagi watched him for a while with a smile on her face before she got on her bike and rode home. The next day, during the break, Mina approached her friends and handed Tsunade a letter. Sanae examined the envelope and asked if it was a love letter. So Mina told her it wasn't, as she was the one who wrote it. Her friends pointed out that she could simply say what she'd written in the letter, but Mina argued that letters were the new iMessage, and everyone was using them. While she tried to make her friends understand the importance of exchanging letters, Nishikata and his friends watched them. Taiko said he couldn't understand the craze about letters, and said it was much easier for one to say whatever they had to say out loud instead of writing it down. He even said love letters were overrated, as writing letters in general was a waste of time and energy. Sanae overheard what the woman repellent said, so she walked over to him and began trying to kick some sense into him. When class resumed, Nishikata was surprised to find a letter inside his textbook. When he flipped it open, Takagi noticed the shocked look on his face, and when she asked if anything was wrong, he told her no. His mind went back to when Taiko mentioned love letters, and he began to wonder if he had a secret admirer. However, he also considered the fact that Takagi could have been the one to send it so she could mess with him. Just then, Takagi told him that she was the one who left the letter in his book, which wasn't a surprise to him. She asked him to read the letter, as she needed a response from him after school, so he opened it after hesitating. In the letter, she asked if he wanted to walk home with her, and even though he was disappointed, he asked why she didn't just say it. Takagi told him she had wanted to try out the new trend, but admitted that she wanted to see his reaction to the letter. Nishikata was so shocked that he forgot he was in class and screamed at Takagi, earning himself a chalk to the head. That night, Nishikata remembered the first date he met Takagi, and how he had gotten in trouble with his teacher for coming late. He had first gone to the staff room to drop off the handkerchief he found on the floor, so by the time he got to class he was late. The teacher warned him never to come late again and refused to listen to his explanation. After he took his seat, Takagi tried to speak with him, but he was so absorbed in his anger that she heard him blame her for his problem. The next moment, they were called to the gymnasium for the entrance ceremony, and when it was done they all returned to class. Nishikata noticed Takagi wasn't in class, and when she returned she suggested they play a game. She said she could guess why he was late, and after she told him, Nishikata stood up and screamed in surprise. This drew the teacher's attention to him, and after he got scolded, he asked Takagi how she knew. She then pulled out the handkerchief, revealing that she was the owner, and then thanked him for finding it. Back in the present, Nishikata finished his push-ups, and when he tried to do a handstand, he fell. The fall caused pain in his knee, and when he rolled up his pants to check it out, he remembered the day he got injured. Immediately, he rushed to his drawer and searched for Takagi's handkerchief. The next day at school, he tried to give Takagi the handkerchief, but she informed him that there was going to be a new seating arrangement. Nishikata was surprised and asked if she was happy about it. So Takagi admitted that she had hoped they would sit next to each other till the end of the year. A little while later, they drew ballots and Nishikata learned that his new seating position was far away from Takagi. When Nishikata got to his new position, he discovered Mono was his neighbor, but she looked so depressed, and when she saw him, she let out a disappointed sigh. Nishikata knew his gorilla-inspired face had nothing to do with her disappointment, so he asked what the problem was. Mono told him it was because she wanted to sit beside Nakai, but since he was so far away it made her sad. Just then, Kimura loudly asked the entire class if any of them would switch places with him and take the front seat. His reason was that he wouldn't be able to eat an early lunch with the teacher standing right in front of him. Hearing this, the teacher told him that only someone with a legitimate reason could switch places with him. Nishikata, on the other hand, thought about Takagi's earlier admission and then decided to switch places with Kimura, claiming he had poor eyesight. Unfortunately, Kimura told him they couldn't switch because someone else had already switched with him. So Nishikata joined Mano's depression party. A little while later, he heard Takagi's voice calling out to him, so he raised his head from his desk, and to his surprise, Takagi was seated next to him. When he asked why, she told him Mano had switched places with her because she wanted to sit next to Nakai, who switched places with Kimura because of his bad eyesight. Takagi then asked Nishikata if he'd tried to switch seats with Kimura because he wanted to sit next to her, and he denied it. Just as she pointed out that his face was red, the teacher asked them to open their textbooks. As they did that, Takagi asked Nishikata what he'd been trying to say to her all day, so he pulled out her handkerchief and returned it to her. He then admitted that he was glad that he got to sit next to her again, and she told him she felt the same. That night, Takagi unfolded the handkerchief as she lay in bed, and a note fell out of it, so she opened it. The note was from Nishikata, and in it, he had written "Thank you." After reading the note, Takagi smiled and flipped herself over, so she could bury her face in her pillow as she kicked her feet in the air like any teenager whose crush finally acknowledged their existence. The following week at school, Nishikata realized he'd forgotten his English textbook at home and began freaking out. However, when Takeji asked him what the problem was, the Usopp in training told her there wasn't a problem. Of course, she knew he was lying and asked if he'd left his English textbook at home. Nishikata was shocked she'd seen through his lies, but decided to come clean and told her yes. Takeji then offered to share her textbook with him and suggested he move his desk closer to hers when it was time for the class. Nishikata refused her offer as he didn't want her to choke on his new garbage colon and said he would find someone else to borrow from. Takeji told him that no one would give him their textbook, but he didn't believe her and swore to prove her wrong. He then stormed out of the class, determined to borrow a textbook because he believed scooting his desk together with Takeji's would be very embarrassing, and he didn't want that. He was also mad at himself for sleeping off after his nightly push-ups without checking if his books were in his bag. For the next few minutes, Nishikata went around asking other students to lend in their English textbook, and they all told him they hadn't brought it, since they didn't have an English class that day. The dumb idiot even went as far as asking Kimura and Takao to lend him theirs, but the overstuffed pork chop and the ugly mole rat reminded him that they were in the same class. Disappointed, Nishikata began walking back to class, but he bumped into Takeji in the hallway, and she asked if he'd borrowed the textbook. He said no, and she told him that it was because they were the only class having English lessons that day, making him realize she knew from the start, but chose to withhold that information because she wanted to tease him. When it was finally time for the English class, an embarrassed Nishikata stood at his desk closer to Takeji's but refused to look in her direction. While the class was going on, Takeji wrote in her textbook that it was a lot of fun being close to him, making the low-budget bubblehead blush. However, he couldn't help but wonder if she was messing with him. And it didn't take long for him to confirm his suspicions, because when he flipped to the next page, he saw that she'd written something else there. This one read, "Because I get to tease you," making him feel more stupid than he already was for believing she was trying to be nice to him. The next moment, the teacher called on him and asked him to translate one of the words written in Japanese into English. Nishikata looked at the book and smirked before giving the man an answer, and since he was correct, the man let him sit down as he continued with the class. Still smirking like a fool, Nishikata began writing in his notebook as he discovered that if he read the words lined up vertically, it translated to "you are an idiot," and it had given him an idea to mess with Takeji. When he was done writing, he handed Takeji the note, which when read normally asked what she thought about eating a large chicken. However, if she read it vertically, she would see a hidden question which asked if she was okay with him winning, and Nishikata felt very proud of himself. He even imagined what Takeji's face would look like once he showed her the hidden message. But she surprised him with a response, and when he finished reading it, he saw that she'd included a hidden message telling him that she'd won. He was so shocked that she'd seen through his trick, because he assumed her IQ was lower than his. Takeji laughed when she saw his shocked face, so he placed his face on his desk so he could wallow in self-pity without seeing the smug look on her face. But she tapped him on the shoulder and gave him another note. In this one, she wrote that she was happy he had given her a note and was looking forward to him doing it again. After reading the note, Nishikata's face took on the color of a fire truck, but he tried to hide it as he was sure she was messing with him. Takeji swore that she was being honest. However, she added there might be a hidden message in the note, so began looking for him, causing her to laugh at him. The next day, Takeji walked in on Nishikata tying a coin to a string, so she asked what he was doing and he explained that he'd seen a hypnotist do it on television the night before. Takeji asked if he wanted to try hypnotizing her with it, and he told her it wouldn't work as hypnosis wasn't a real thing. Still, she insisted, saying it would be fun and there was no harm in trying, so he gave in. As he swung the coin before her eyes like a pendulum ball, he repeated the words he'd heard the hypnotist say. Takeji found them funny and began laughing, so Nishikata decided to stop since he was embarrassed. Immediately, she apologized and convinced him to carry on, so he did until he noticed that her eyes had glazed over. At first, he was thrilled that he hypnotized her, but then he remembered that she liked to tease him. However, when he noticed she didn't move a muscle, he ordered her to raise her right hand. Takeji did as he ordered, so he told her to drop it and asked her to say Nishikata is a genius. Once again, Takeji complied with his orders, making it clear to him that she'd been hypnotized. He then asked her to make peace signs with her fingers and act like a crab. Takeji did everything he asked her to do, and that made the dimwit feel like he was better at hypnotizing people than any vampire alive. With that thought in mind, he asked what her weaknesses were, and she told him. But he wasn't satisfied with just that. He wanted her to do something that would make her feel embarrassed, and after using his only functioning brain cell, he got an idea. This time around, he ordered Takeji to pick her nose, something he knew she'd never be willing to do in front of him. As Takeji moved her finger towards her nose, the smile on his face dropped as he felt making her do something like that was wrong. He tried to get her to stop, but Takeji surprised him by diverting her finger from her face and using it to poke him. Since he was ticklish, He began laughing until she stopped and called him a half-baked idiot for believing she was hypnotized. Embarrassed, Nishikata apologized for his actions, so she told him that she had forgiven him and asked him to let her hypnotize him. Later that day, as Nishikata and Takeji walked home together, Nishikata asked if she wanted to go to the river to cool off as the weather was too hot. Takeji agreed, and that made him happy as he had ulterior motives for coming up with that suggestion. However, Takeji wasn't dumb and pointed out that he only wanted to go to the river, so he would challenge her to a rock-skipping contest. Nishikata denied it, so Takeji told him that if he held her hand, she would count it as a win for him. Feeling embarrassed, he declined her offer, saying he didn't need help to win. When they got to the riverbed, Nishikata insisted on finding the perfect stone for the contest, and when he found it, he smiled to himself as he was sure of his victory. Takeji told him that he could go first, but before he threw the stone, she asked what his skipping record was. The frog-eyed half-wit told her it was 15 times, which was a lie almost as big as his head. Takeji didn't react to what he said, making him feel uneasy, but he pushed those feelings aside and prepared to take the shot. Right before he let go of the stone, Takeji told him that her record was 30 times. Causing him to falter and the stone to sink the moment it touched the water. While Nishikata came to terms with his loss, Takeji calmly stated that she always wished to make her stones skip 30 times but could only do 3. She also smiled at him and said he'd made 0 skips, and that made him swear vengeance. Unfortunately, he was so preoccupied with thoughts of revenge that he didn't notice she'd picked up a stone and was already throwing it. Takeji's stone skipped 3 times before it sank, and Nishikata fell to his knees in defeat. Since she was generous, she suggested a rematch, which he grudgingly agreed to and began searching for another stone. While he did that, Takeji noticed one of Mr. Crab's relatives crawl out of a hole and tried to show it to Nishikata. Nishikata chose to ignore her as he believed she was trying to trick him again, and he was determined not to fall for her tricks a second time. When he found the perfect stone, he stood up happily, but accidentally pushed Takeji towards the water. Realizing what he'd done, he quickly grabbed her hand and pulled her back, but he used too much force, causing him to swap places with her and fall into the water. On their way home after his involuntary swim, Nishikata was unhappy that he'd lost the game. Takeji noticed him sulking, so she brought up the fact that he'd held her hand while trying to save her. Nishikata said it didn't count as hand-holding, so she reminded him of what she'd said about letting him win if he held her hand. Still, he insisted they hadn't held hands, so Takeji stopped talking about it and bid him farewell when she got to her street. A few days later, as Takeji and Nishikata walked to school together in the morning, Takeji mentioned that her hands were numb as she couldn't stand the cold. Out of the goodness of his heart, Nishikata offered her his hand warmer, but she told him she would be fine without it, so he put it in his pocket. Soon after that, they came to a stop when they noticed a large ice puddle, and Nishikata was very excited about it. Takeji noticed how his fingers curled and uncurled, so she asked if he wanted to pick it up. Nishikata said no, stating that playing with ice was something little kids did, but she knew it was a lie. After thinking about it for a while, she proposed they have an ice-carrying contest, and said that whoever carried the largest piece of ice to the school gate without dropping it would be the winner. Nishikata agreed without any hesitation, and because he wanted to prove that he was the reincarnation of Jack Frost, he carried a large piece of ice. As they walked to school, Takeji pointed out that he looked like a kid happy to be playing with a block of ice, but he argued that it wasn't so. His mini outburst caused him to let go of the ice, but thanks to his amazing reflexes, he caught the ice before it hit the ground. Takeji laughed at him and walked away, making him realize that she was trying to get him to let his guard down and drop the ice. Armed with this knowledge, he became more determined not to drop his ice and gripped it tightly. Of course, Takeji noticed this and pointed out that if he kept holding the ice tightly it would shatter. Nishikata ignored her as he believed she was only trying to distract him, but he did consider that she was right about his grip being too tight. Suddenly, she told him that the loser would have to warm the hands of the winner, shocking him into dropping his ice. After it shattered at his feet, Takeji laughed out loud and told him to carry out his duty as the loser. Nishikata asked if there was some other penalty he could do, but she said no, so he pulled out his hand warmer and gave it to her. The following day, Nishikata waited for Takeji on the road so they could walk to school together. When she arrived, he grinned like the Cheshire Cat, so she asked what contest idea he had in his empty head. Attempting to sound like the Riddler and failing miserably, Nishikata asked what was different about his appearance. He was so smug about it since he was sure she'd never guessed that he'd trimmed his hair the night before. However, Takeji wiped that smug look off his face by saying she knew what was different about him. Instead of telling him what it was, she asked him to let her look closer at him, so he did his best to remain unmoving like a mannequin. In his head, he was sure she was trying to trick him into telling her what it was, but he was determined not to fall for her tricks. Having Takeji close to him made him uncomfortable, but he pretended he was fine until she raised his shirt and caused him to freak out. Immediately, he asked why she was trying to get a preview of his summer body, and she assured him that his twig-like body wasn't her spec. This annoyed him as he deluded himself into thinking he'd finally bulked up enough to be mistaken for Guido on the road. Since he was preoccupied with sulking, Takagi poked his side and teased him when he began laughing. When she finally stopped, she moved closer to him, trying to figure out what had changed about his appearance. Just like the first time, Nishikata became embarrassed, but he kept quiet as she began circling him like a shark and whispering in his ear at intervals. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore and told her that her time was up. Takagi then said to him that his hair was different, causing him to dramatically fall to his knees as she laughed at him. Once he got over the fact that she'd won, he asked how she'd known it was his hair, and she told him that it was because a person's hair was the easiest thing to change. Before they began walking to school, she told him she would change something about herself the next day and have him guess what it was. Nishikata wasn't thrilled with that idea because he knew he would be too embarrassed to look her over the same way she did to him. Meanwhile, Yukari arrived at school with a new haircut, and when her friend saw it, Mina burst into laughter. She told Yukari it was bold of her to show off her natural headlights, and Yukari explained that it wasn't intentional. She said she was trying to trim her hair the night before, but accidentally cut off more than she intended to. Still, Mina kept laughing, which annoyed Yukari to the point where she pointed out that Mina's hair could pass for a bird's nest. Immediately, Mina stopped laughing and fell to her knees in despair, so Yukari apologized for what she said. Mina also apologized for what she said, but when she looked up again and spotted Yukari's big-ass forehead, she started laughing again. The following week, Nishikata and Takagi walked to school together as usual, but Nishikata wasn't himself. This was because it was Valentine's Day, and he was freaking out internally as he didn't know if Takagi would give him chocolate. When they got to school, he hoped someone had put some chocolate in his locker, but when he opened it and found it empty, he was disappointed. The ever-observant Takagi noticed his reaction and asked what the problem was, but he swore there wasn't any before he rushed to class. Later that day, during class, Nishikata kept stealing glances at Takagi. He couldn't understand why she hadn't given him any chocolates but tried to convince himself that he didn't want any. When Takagi asked to borrow his eraser, his delusional mind assumed she would hand him some chocolate when she returned the eraser, but once again, he was disappointed. As the day progressed, it became clear that Nishikata wasn't the only one with his panties in a twist about chocolates. It seemed that Mono was also worried about chocolates, but in her case, she was concerned about how to give Nakati the chocolates she brought him. While she was trying to think of a way to give it to him, Mina went to stand at the teacher's podium and announced that she was giving chocolates to everyone. Some of their classmates approached her to get chocolates while Mono watched from afar, wishing she was as bold as Mina. Just then, their teacher walked in and seized Mina's chocolates, since it was against school rules to give out Valentine's Day chocolate. Later that day, Mono asked Takagi if she'd given anyone chocolates, and Takagi said yes, so Mono begged her to tell how she'd gone about it. Even after listening to what Takagi said, Mono still couldn't decide how to give Nakai the chocolates. She felt it was embarrassing to walk up to him and hand it over, but in the end, she approached him while he spoke to his friends. However, she didn't feel confident enough to hand over the chocolate to him, so she just stood there staring at him. His friends soon realized what she was trying to do and began teasing her for it until she felt so embarrassed that she ran away. Nakai later found her by the staircase and asked why she was angry with him, since he'd assumed she ran away because of him. Mono just called him a dense fool and asked if he wanted chocolates, to which he said yes. Just as she was about to hand the chocolate over to him, their teacher walked by and saw them. Mono became scared, thinking he'd take the chocolates away, but Nakati quickly told the man that Mono was returning the book she borrowed from him. It was a dumb lie, but since the man was dumber than Anasuke, he believed it and walked away. Once he was out of sight, Nakati turned to Mono and thanked her for the chocolates. Instead of responding to him, she stormed off in anger, so he chased after her, asking what he'd done wrong. After school that day, Nishikata bid Takagi farewell and left their classroom. As soon as he got outside, he had a mini meltdown because he couldn't believe she hadn't given him any chocolate. He was still feeling depressed about it when he walked to his locker to change his shoes. However, when he opened his locker, he was surprised to find a box of chocolate waiting for him. Takagi popped out of nowhere when he pulled it out and asked if he knew who had left the chocolate. Nishikata panicked as he hadn't expected to see her, so he told her that he suspected Kimura had put it in his locker to mess with him. Takagi said it wasn't Kimura, because she knew who placed the chocolate in his locker. She also said the person was close by, making him wonder if she was trying to hint that she had put the chocolate in his locker. He considered asking if she was the person who left the chocolate, but Takagi didn't give him that chance because she offered him some obligatory chocolate. However, after he took the chocolate, she made a comment that left him even more confused about the identity of his secret chocolate giver. 2 months later, Nishikata asked Takagi to meet him by the roadside, and when she arrived, she thanked him for inviting her out on a date. Nishikata became flushed but swore that it wasn't a date. He told her he'd heard from Kimura that the candy shop was having a special sale that day. He said he was only trying to fulfill this promise to buy her her some candy after losing their bet. So Takeji laughed and asked him to lead the way. As they walked to the store, Nishikata told himself that the day had finally come when he would win against the wannabe trickster god. Ignorant of his plans, Takeji suggested they join Mina, Yukari, and Sanai at the park later in the day to watch the cherry blossoms bloom. Nishikata agreed, saying that once they've had their fun at the store they would head to the park. Satisfied with his answer, Takaki kept walking, unaware that Nishikata had invited her out to play an April Fool's Day prank on her. He'd lied about the ongoing special sale because he wanted to see the sad look on her face once they got to the store. Unfortunately for him, when they got to the store, he realized that he'd been royally screwed over by the plot gods because there was truly a special sale going on. He was so shocked that he began complaining internally while reacting physically to the sale notice posted outside the store. Takeji noticed this and asked if he acted that way because his plan had backfired. Nishikata didn't respond as he was busy wondering how she'd figured out he was up to no good. Taking his silence as an answer, Takeji walked into the store, so he had no choice but to follow her in like a lost puppy. Inside the store, they checked the shelves and Takeji picked out a candy named Grass Clusters. Nishikata told her to put it back, saying it probably tasted gross, but Takeji told him not to knock it until he tried it. This statement gave him an idea, so he told her to pay for it. But when she did, he began to rethink his decision. He still believed the candy was disgusting, but he planned to eat it and pretend it tasted nice, so that Takeji would eat it and complain about the taste. However, when he ate the candy, he was surprised that it tasted nice, so he searched for another candy. Unfortunately, none of the ones he bought tasted bad, making him feel disappointed that his plan to trick Takeji had failed. As they sat down together, Takeji told him that he was stupid to think he could trick her because it was April Fool's Day. Nishikata tried to deny it, but Takeji cut him off, saying she'd been excited to spend the day with him. Nishikata didn't believe what she said, but Takeji sounded very convincing when she said it. She then stood up from the table and went to stand at the door, but instead of going outside, she asked Nishikata if he wanted to be in the same class as her when they became second-year students. Nishikata found her question strange, as it was common knowledge that they didn't change classes even if they'd moved to another grade. Takeji explained that Sanai had said their teacher told her the school would add another class because some students were transferring in. Upon hearing this, Nishikata realized that if new students transferred to the school, there would be a class change for everyone. At first, he was pleased with the idea that a class change could mean he would be free from Takeji and all her teasing. However, all that changed when he imagined what sitting in class would be like without her. When Takeji repeated her question, Nishikata timidly told her he wanted to be in the same class as her, but swore it was because he wanted revenge for all the teasing she'd done to him. Takeji just smiled and assured him that they would be in the same class since the teacher had been referring to the third-year students when he said what he said to Sanai. This made Nishikata feel revealed, but it also made him scold Takeji for messing with him again, causing her to laugh. When she eventually stopped, she told him she hoped they would sit next to each other when the new term began. Her words made Nishikata blush, so he turned away and said he also had the same wish. At the same time in the park, Mina and her friends had already spread out a picnic blanket. They were supposed to be watching the flowers bloom, but Mina thought it would be a good time to get her cardio sessions in, so she was jogging on the spot. Sanai was busy eating the food they had brought along and Yukari was sneezing since she was allergic to pollen. When Mina teased her about her weak immune system, she told the vertically challenged gnome to mind her business. She also asked why she was busy jogging on the spot, and Mina said it was a part of her diet. Yukari pointed out that she didn't have a single fat bone in her body, but Mina said she was doing all that jogging for the future. She then asked the girls to join her, but they declined her offer. Sanai because she was a track team member and was always running, and Yukari because she couldn't be bothered with doing something so stressful. Mina accepted Sanai's explanation but told Yukari that if didn't get off her lazy ass and exercise, she would end up looking like a certain bear in a red crop top. This statement offended Yukari, so she told Mina that according to statistics, boys liked girls who were on the thicker side. This made Mina pause her jogging and say that if it were true, all the models on television wouldn't look so thin. Yukari argued that it was only so on TV, but Mina insisted that it wasn't, so Stanite asked why she was obsessed with being skinny. She told them it was because she wanted to become a curvy glamour model when she was older. As soon as she said this, her friends looked at her chest, which was as flat as a runway, and her non-existent hips. Thankfully, Takagi and Nishikata arrived the next moment, so the girls didn't get to tell her that no matter what she did, she could never look like Kylie Jenner. A few days later, Nishikata was holed up in his room, reading the 100% unrequited love manga, when he recalled what happened a few days after their entrance exam. On that day, Takagi had teased him as usual, so he tried to think of a way to get back at her. During their break period, he sat in the hallway with Fat Boy and Kimura and Takao, but he didn't speak to them because he was lost in thought. A few minutes later, Senai called out to Kimura and approached them to give the fatso a piece of paper with a list of books she wanted him to find in the library. After she walked away, Takao The low-budget Bugs Bunny asked Kimura if he and Sanae were close because she hadn't used any honorifics while speaking to him. Kimura said they weren't and explained that Sanae had never used honorifics when speaking to him. He admitted that he found it intimidating whenever she talked to him, and Takao said it was normal to feel that way when a person you weren't close to talked to you without honorifics. After hearing this, Nishikata got the brilliant idea to address Takagi without any honorifics, hoping it would intimidate her. Unfortunately, he lost all his nerves after he attempted to do it, so Takagi asked why he tried to drop the honorific while addressing her. At first, he denied ever doing that, but Takagi told him she knew he was lying, so he admitted he'd been trying to intimidate her. Takagi laughed after hearing this but surprised him by saying she wouldn't mind if he dropped the honorific while talking to her. Nishikata felt like she only said that because she wanted to tease him, and she proved him right when she said that talking without honorifics showed how intimate people were with each other. Immediately, he began to blush, and she teased him for it before telling him to try saying her name with any honorific whenever he wanted to. She then stood up to leave, but before she got to the door, she stopped and began saying his name without honorifics, and asked if she could call his name with the honorific moving forward. Nishikata told her she was free to do as she pleased because he knew if he told her no, she would do it anyway. Back in the present, Nishikata told himself that once the new term began, he would show Takagi that he was no longer the clueless nitwit he was when they were in their first year. When school resumed the following week, Nishikata walked into class determined to show Takagi that he was a changed person. When she walked him and greeted him good morning without teasing him, he congratulated her for outgrowing her childishness, saying that it was the appropriate behavior of an upperclassman. He also said other things about how they ought to be more mature now that they were second-year students. So Takagi asked if she could test how mature he was. Determined to prove her wrong, Nishikata agreed even though he was certain she had a trick up her sleeve. Takagi then pretended to be a curious first-year student and asked if he had a crush on someone, which surprised him. However, he remembered that something similar had happened in the 100% Unrequited Love anime he had watched the previous day, so he decided to reenact the scene by repeating what was said. He didn't expect Takagi to respond to him using the same words from the anime and accidentally said her name without any honorifics. When he realized what he'd done, he apologized, but Takagi told him it was okay and encouraged him to repeat it. He attempted to, but was too much of a coward, and in the end, he added the honorific. Takagi laughed at his expense and told him that since he'd failed to go through with it, he had to call her Takagi-senpai until she asked him to stop. A few days later, Nishikata arm wrestled with his friends and won each game, so they asked how he'd gotten so strong. He bragged that it was because of his daily push-ups, but didn't have the balls to admit that he couldn't do more than 3 push-ups to save his life. While they arm wrestled, they didn't notice Takagi pass by the window and returned to watch them when she spotted Takagi among them. After school that day, Nishikata stayed behind to clean the science room because Takagi had gotten him in trouble with their teacher. When Takagi eventually dropped by while he was cleaning, he tried to ignore her, but she asked him to bring a chair over so they could talk. Curious, he did as she asked, and she surprised him by asking him to arm wrestle with her. Thinking that she was unaware of his arm wrestling skills, Nishikata agreed to arm wrestle her, and she told him that the loser had to buy the winner juice on the way home. Just before he grabbed her hand, he suddenly recalled the day he saved her from falling into the river and froze. Takagi noticed his hesitation, so she asked if he felt embarrassed to hold her hand, and he denied it. However, when they finally held hands, Nishikata realized that Takagi's hands were soft, making him feel things he couldn't explain. It also made him nervous to the point where his palm became sweaty, and when Takagi pointed it out, he pulled his hand away to wipe it on his shirt. When they began the match, he noticed that Takagi was struggling, which made him feel like he was the Hulk. Watching as she desperately tried to beat him made him drop his guard, and when she noticed this, she quickly used that to her advantage, winning the round for herself. Nishikata couldn't believe he'd been stupid enough to underestimate her, so he jumped at the chance to redeem himself when she proposed that they go for a second round. Takagi made him drop his guard this time by asking if he wanted to hold her hand on the way home. Nishikata was so shocked by the question that he didn't have time to react, and she slammed his hand on the table. After losing for the second time in a row, Nishikata refused a rematch, so Takagi offered to help him finish cleaning the room. On their way home later, Takagi reminded Nishikata that he was supposed to buy her juice since she won the arm wrestling match, so they stopped by the vending machine. He was still feeling sad that he'd lost to a girl, but he cheered up when an idea came to him. This was because a few days ago, he'd been hanging out with Kimura and Hamaguchi had asked them what acting mature meant. Instead of answering his question, Kimura asked if he had a crush on a girl named Pauju, which surprised him. When he tried to deny it, Kimura told him it was painfully obvious that he was a shameless simp for Hoju and advised him not to shoot his shot because Hoju wouldn't date a loser like him since she preferred mature guys. Hamaguchi told him to keep his dating advice to himself as he only wanted to know what acting like a grown-up meant. After listening to what Hamaguchi said, Nishikata figured that if he could learn to act more mature, Takagi would stop teasing him. So he begged Kimura to tell them what he knew. Believe it or not, this dumbass waste of space told his friends that for one to be mature, they had to drink coffee. Back in the present, Nishikata bought a can of coffee at the vending machine, hoping it would show Takagi his maturity. When Takagi saw in the can of coffee, she pointed out that he didn't like bitter things, but Nishikata assured her that he could handle the taste of coffee. This was because he'd taken a few sips from the coffee his mother made for herself, and he was sure that all coffee tasted the same. However, he soon learned that homemade coffee and canned coffee weren't the same because after he took a sip from his can, he realized the coffee was bitter. Determined not to lose face in front of Takagi, he swallowed the drink and lied that it was refreshing, but Takagi knew he was lying and laughed at him. She then decided to mess with him by saying it would taste better if he swished the coffee in his mouth a bit. Nishikata foolishly believed what she said and gave it a shot, but the taste remained the same and Takagi kept laughing at him. Tired of being the focus of her attention, he asked her to pick the drink she wanted. So Takagi picked a melon soda, which Nishikata wished to take a sip of. After he threw his coffee can away, Takagi offered him her soda, saying that drinking it would get rid of the bitter coffee taste. Immediately, he reached for the soda can, but Takagi reminded him that drinking from it was the same as indirectly kissing her. This made him change his mind and say he enjoyed the coffee's aftertaste even though he didn't. Takagi then shocked him by saying that drinking coffee didn't make him look more grown up. A few days later, Takagi walked into class and greeted Nishikata as usual, but he responded to her greeting nonchalantly. This prompted her to ask if something was wrong, and he told her no while trying to act all mysterious. Takagi just stared at him, wondering if his pea-sized brain had finally given up on trying to function properly. Nishikata, on the other hand, was stuck in his head, remembering the movie he'd watched the previous day. This movie was also the reason he was trying to act like the coolest kid on the block. But Takagi interrupted his daydream by poking his side. When he screamed, Takagi laughed and said a quote from the same movie he'd been reminiscing about, making him realize that she'd also watched the movie. They had a little back and forth for the next few minutes, recreating different moments from the film in their own way. During that time, Takagi asked Nishikata to guess if her crush was in the same class as them. She told him that if he got the answer wrong, she'd poke his sides until he laughed so hard and peed his pants. Nishikata then told her that her crush wasn't in their class, so she poked him because he got the answer wrong. He had to beg her to stop, so she did, allowing him to catch his breath and finally think about her question. He couldn't help but wonder which of their classmates was Takagi's crush, but he also considered that she may have asked that question to mess with him. Just then, Takagi called out to him and apologized for putting him on the spot with her question. She then offered to answer any questions he may have about her, but since he was very predictable, she already knew he would ask what her weaknesses were. Nishikata denied it, but Takagi pretended not to hear him and said her weakness was that she couldn't help but tease him whenever she saw him. After school that day, as Mina waited for Sanai and Yukari to pack their bags, she asked Sanai if she had training and Sanai said that she did. The next moment, she noticed Takagi and Nishikata walking out of the classroom, so she went after them and informed Nishikata that there was a committee meeting that day. After hearing this, Takagi wished Nishikata good luck and left, but Yukari couldn't help but feel bad that she was separating the two. Nishikata, on the other hand, suddenly realized that since he was put on the field trip committee, Takagi's teasing had reduced. While he counted how many times she'd teased him that day, Yukari watched him with pitiful eyes, as she assumed he was counting how many days he couldn't walk home with Takagi. Mina and Sanai stood behind her, commenting on how tough it must be to be separated from their lover, since just like everyone else, they believed Takagi and Nishikata were an item. That weekend, Nishikata's mother asked him to run to the cake shop to collect his birthday cake. On his way there, he ran into Takagi, and he couldn't help but feel embarrassed at the thought of her finding out where he was going and why. After they made small talk, Takagi asked Nishikata where he was heading, and instead of answering her or coming up with a lie, he proposed that they play a game. The game was simple. They would each guess where the other person was going, and to his surprise, she agreed. He asked her to let him guess first and said that she was going to the cake shop. He said this because he hoped that if he got it right, he would wait until she left the cake shop before he went in to collect his order. But if he was wrong, he'd just go to the shop. Immediately they parted ways. To his surprise, Takagi said she was going to the cake shop and then guessed that he was also going to the cake shop. Nishikata's reaction made her know she'd guessed correctly, so he asked how she knew he was going to the cake shop. She said it was because she could read him like a book, and Nishikata felt disappointed that he couldn't beat her. Later at the cake shop, while they waited for their turn, Nishikata became worried that his mother had requested a corny birthday message to be written on his cake. When it was finally their turn, Takagi asked if she could collect her order first, and Nishikata gladly accepted. While she talked with the staff, Nishikata prayed that she would leave immediately after she got her order, but he also knew that Takagi tended to do the opposite of what he expected from her. However, after Takagi collected her order, She approached him and handed him the bag, saying it was his prize for winning their game earlier. After she left the shop, Nishikata kept staring at the door, wondering if Takagi had been body snatched. When he got home later, he placed his cake in the fridge, and when his mother asked what was inside the bag, he told her the bag contained some freebies from the cake shop. He then ran out of the kitchen. Once he got to his room, he opened the bag and saw a cookie with "Happy Birthday" written on it, and a keychain with the face of the female lead from the 100% Unrequited Love anime on it. Seeing these thoughtful gifts made him happy, as he hadn't expected Takagi to give him anything for his birthday. So a few days later, he shyly thanked her for the presents on their way home. The following week, their class had a sports test in the gym, and as always, Nishikata turned it into a game between him and Takagi. He approached her while she was doing her stretches and said that if he had the highest total score on the test, she would never tease him again. Takagi laughed at his absurd request, but agreed to go along with it on the condition that if she won, she would tease him for life. Takagi didn't argue with her, as he had so much faith that he would win, since he'd completed his training arc successfully in preparation for that day. After the teacher signaled for tests to begin, Nishikata proved all his training hadn't been in vain and racked up points, which he proudly showed Takagi when she asked how he was faring. Takagi congratulated him for a job well done and admitted that she was losing, but promised she would catch up to him once the next round was completed. This made Nishikata remember that the next round was the toe-touching test, and since he didn't have the flexibility of a gymnast like Takagi did, he failed the test. He received 3 points for his attempt, while Takagi received 10 points, which he knew put him at a disadvantage. However, he was determined to turn the table with the next round, which was the grip strength test. Takagi's grip strength was 17.2 kilograms, earning her just 3 points, but she didn't mind, as she never expected to receive high points on that test. Meanwhile, Nishikata was sure he'd get 10 points, but before he could take the test, Kimura, who was helping record his points, excused himself to go to the bathroom. His sudden departure left Nishikata distracted, so he accidentally gripped the device. When he realized what he'd done, he looked at the grip strength and saw that it was 8.9 kilograms. He then decided to concentrate and focus on opening his 8 inner gates to increase his strength. Unfortunately, he was interrupted by Takagi, who proposed that they have the grip strength match face-to-face. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Nishikata declined her proposal, so she wished him luck, promising to cheer him on from the sidelines. This only succeeded in making Nishikata suspicious of her, as he was sure she planned to distract him. However, he was confident in his total concentration breathing technique and was determined not to fall for her tricks. The only problem was that Takagi never played fair, and while he was trying to concentrate, she called out to him, asking if he wanted to hold her hands. Immediately, he began to imagine himself and Takagi holding hands, making him release his grip on the device. When he realized what he'd done, he looked at the device to get the reading and saw that his grip strength was 3.8 kilograms. He then fell to his knees in despair, and Takagi asked if he'd released his grip because he'd been imagining them holding hands. Nishikata denied it, saying he'd realized his grip because he was surprised. But Takagi told him to stop trying to sound modest. Tired of arguing with her, Nishikata told her that he was ready to accept his loss, and Takagi asked if he was sure. When he told her yes, she pulled out her score sheet and showed it to him, as she informed him that her scores were lower than his. Nishikata couldn't believe she'd played him, but Takagi told him not to feel bad and said he could always make a comeback during the next sports test. Later that day, their teacher gave them the guide booklets for their camping trip and informed them that the trip would begin the next day. While everyone flipped through the booklet, Nishikata plotted ways to render Takagi speechless on their way home, since he no longer had committee meetings to attend. After classes, Takagi got up to leave, but Nishikata quickly rushed after her and told her that he no longer had to stay back for committee meetings. While he was rambling on like an idiot, Takagi kept staring at him, which made him realize just how desperate he sounded, so he kept quiet. Takagi then told him she would love to walk home with him, halting all the negative and derogatory things he was saying to himself. Instead of going home, they stopped by the empty lot where they practiced their tandem riding and decided to play dodgeball. Nishikata was sure he'd emerge the winner of the game, since he usually used the Ultra Instincts technique to dodge balls like a pro. However, Takagi kept spinning the ball on her finger instead of throwing it, so Nishikata asked if she was doing that to show him how good she was at handling balls. She responded by saying that she would let him find out if he allowed her to bounce the ball off the wall behind him. Nishikata didn't see how she could achieve that, as the wall was far from her, so he turned to look at it. The moment he did that, she threw the ball at him and announced that she'd won when it hit him. Nishikata complained that she'd cheated, so she agreed to play the game again as long as he caught the ball and did not dodge it. Nishikata agreed and readied himself to catch the ball, but instead of throwing it at him, Takagi threw the ball in the air. Hoping to be cast in the new season of Haikyuu, Nishikata jumped in the air in a feeble attempt to catch the ball. All he succeeded in doing was lightly touching the ball before it fell outside the court. So once again, Takeji claimed victory for herself. After the game, they stopped by the candy shop to buy some snacks for their trip, and after picking the stuff they wanted, Nishikata noticed some cup noodles on the nearby shelf. Takeji asked if he wanted to buy them for the trip, and he told her he wanted to buy them because he was hungry. Takeji decided to also get one, and after they sat down to eat, Takeji pointed out that they looked like they were on a date. Nishikata nearly choked on his noodles the moment the words left her mouth. He then told her not to say absurd things like that, but Takeji insisted that she was right. She even said that if any of their classmates saw them, they would also assume they were on a date. Nishikata assured her that if that happened, he'd simply deny it. So the universe decided to test him by sending Kimura and Takao to the shop. The moment they walked in and saw Takeji and Nishikata, they froze, but quickly recovered and went to make their purchase. Nishikata, on the other hand, wished that the ground would open up and swallow him because he felt embarrassed about the situation. After Ed and Eddie finished paying for the items they wanted, they walked towards the door but paused by the table to stare at Nishikata. They didn't say a word, and that bothered Nishikata because he hoped they would tease him about being on a date so he could deny it and set the record straight. Unfortunately, his wish was never granted and his friends quietly walked out of the shop. Once they were gone, Takeji pointed out that his friends thought they were on a date, but Nishikata told her it wasn't so. She then asked if he would hate it if they truly believed they were on a date, but Nishikata didn't have an answer for her. Takeji was okay with it and went back to her food, making him wonder if she considered what they were doing as a date. The next day, they went on the camping trip as planned, and while they were posing for a class picture, Takeji told Nishikata she was glad they were in the same group for the orientation. She said it was because he was a clumsy elf, and she needed to keep an eye out for him, which made him complain. Unfortunately, his voice was too loud and caught the attention of their teacher, who screamed at him to shut up. Nishikata quickly apologized while Takeji laughed at him, so he swore to get her back for what she'd done. He planned to make a peace sign behind her as the picture was taken, so that the picture would look haunted. However, he couldn't go through with the plan because Takeji made a face which made him laugh so hard just as the picture was taken. After that, they split into their various groups and went hiking on the side of a mountain. Nishikata's group consisted of Takeji, Mano, and Akadi, and while they were hiking, Nakati mentioned that they had only one checkpoint left. Takeji said it was thanks to the map Nishikata drew which allowed them to navigate the area properly. Nishikata accepted Takeji's praise, but internally, he wasn't happy that he couldn't carry out his elaborate plan to tease Takeji. Believe it or not, the tryhard Denise the Menace had purposely picked that route because there were a lot of things there that he could use to tease Takeji. The only problem was that he was too embarrassed to excite his plans in front of Nakati and Mano. Just then, Mano announced that she needed to rest, so Nakati suggested that she and Takeji rest while he and Nishikata proceeded to the last checkpoint. After he said this, Mano screamed in frustration but told Nakati there wasn't anything wrong when he asked why she screamed. Nishikata was quick to deduce that Mano wanted to stay in that spot with Nakati, but unfortunately, Nakati was the densest fool to walk the earth, so he didn't realize that was what she wanted. While Nishikata tried to think of a way to let his feather-brained friend know what his girlfriend wanted, Takeji spoke up. She said Nishikata wanted to show her something at the last checkpoint, so she couldn't stay back. Realizing what she was doing, Nishikata backed her up and suggested that Mano and Nakati stay back. Nakati agreed but wished Nishikata luck because he assumed he wanted to spend time alone with Takeji. As Takeji and Nishikata made their way to the last checkpoint, it suddenly began to rain, so they ran to take shelter at the nearest rest stop. While there, Takeji took off her jacket and hung it to dry before sitting down. Her closeness made Nishikata feel some way, but when she asked if being alone with her gave him wild thoughts, he denied it. To ensure that his virgin mind remained pure for the duration of their stay at the rest stop, he proposed that they play a game. He told her that for the game, she had to eat whatever snack he handed to her while her eyes were closed and guess which snack it was. Takeji agreed, but he found it suspicious that she quickly agreed to play the game, so he asked if she'd already eaten the snacks before and knew how they tasted. Takeji assured him that she hadn't, so he calmed down and asked her to close her eyes so they could begin the game. Takeji did as he asked, but surprised him by opening her mouth. When he asked why she had opened her mouth, she said it was so that he would feed the snacks to her. Nishikata told her that feeding someone was a thing couples did, and there were a couple. But Takeji pointed out that she could guess the snack right away if she touched them. Realizing that she was right, he agreed to feed her. But before he could do so, she told him that she wouldn't mind if his fingers touched her lips. Immediately, he freaked out as that statement made his mind wonder what else she wouldn't mind touching her lips. Eventually, he scolded himself for overreacting as he was sure she'd said that to distract him from the task at hand. He then proceeded to carefully put a chocolate-covered snack in her mouth, and she correctly guessed what it was. He didn't like that she'd guessed correctly, and she laughed at him for being stupid enough to start with something so obvious. The next moment, they noticed that it had stopped raining, so Takeji suggested that they play one more round before returning to camp. She also told him that for that round he'd be eating her, eating the snack. Later that evening, the students prepared their dinner, and when they were finished, they sat down to eat. Kimura dramatically sighed after he finished eating, and Takao told him not to get depressed over the fact that he had no more food left. He reminded the walking fat storage that he had 5 servings of curry, but Kimura shamelessly told him that he'd had 7. While they had this discussion, Nishikata was lost in thought, berating himself for failing to tease Takagi earlier. He decided that he'd find an opening later on during the campfire event. Since he was so lost in thought, he didn't hear when Takao and Kimura told him they were going. They had to call his name a few more times before he acknowledged them. After they walked away, Takagi approached him and asked if he'd come up with a plan to get back at her. He admitted that he hadn't, so she told him that if he agreed to hold her hand, she would accept defeat. Nishikata became flustered, but before he could respond, their teacher announced that they should all gather at the field once they were done cleaning up. Suddenly, Nishikata was struck with an idea, so he told Takagi that he would take her up on her offer once he was done eating. His new plan was to use the folk dance as an excuse to hold her hand, but as usual, Takagi saw through the plan. Just as he began swallowing his food, she told him that there was a rumor that if the last person you held hands with during a folk dance was your crush, you'd both fall in love with each other. The next moment, Nishikata began to choke, but he managed to force the food down his throat and asked Takagi what she was trying to insinuate. Takagi just smiled and told him that she was looking forward to their contest. During the campfire event, Nishikata asked his friends about the rumor, and Kimura confirmed that it was a well-known rumor. He said some upperclassmen had done it, and it had worked out well for them, so Hamaguchi planned to use the same strategy to bag Honshu. Kimura then advised him to do the same with Takagi, but he told him that he'd rather swallow a box of nails than date her. His friend knew he was lying, but didn't attempt to argue with him about it, and instead chose to talk about how nerve-wracking it would be for them to dance with girls. Just then, their teacher appeared out of nowhere and told the both of them that since there weren't enough girls, they had to join the girls' side during the dance. Soon, the dance began, and with each step Nishikata took towards Takagi, he became nervous. However, when it was finally time for him to partner with her for the dance, the music stopped, and she told him it was a bummer they didn't get to dance, as they would have fallen in love. Nishikata tried to act like he didn't care, and told her that the only thing he regretted was the fact that he didn't win. Before Takagi could respond, the girls were asked to head to the baths, so Takagi excused herself. Later that night, while Kimura snored like a pig and the rest of the students slept, Nishikata snuck out of his tent. As he walked around, he found Takagi standing on some rocks and asked why she wasn't in her tent. She told him she'd come out to wish on the stars and then asked if he'd snuck out of his tent because he wanted to see her. Nishikata denied it. The next moment, she told him that their teacher was behind him, but Takagi didn't believe her until he turned around and saw the man. Fortunately, he was still far away, so they quickly hid and waited for him to finish checking the place and leave. The place they were bidding was so crammed that when Takagi spoke, she did it directly in Nishikata's ear, causing him to freak out. Takagi apologized and suggested that they remain in that spot for a while longer so that the teacher wouldn't catch them. As they gazed at the stars, Nishikata asked Takagi what she'd wished for, and she told him she wished to stargaze with him, which made him blush. A few weeks later, Nishikata's class had their PE class in the gym, and the teacher asked him to stay behind to clean up. While he was taking some balls to the storage room, Takagi came to help him, making sure to tease him until they arrived at their destination. Takagi went in first, and as Nishikata followed her, he told himself that he hated how dark and creepy the stove room was. However, he also decided it would be a good place to play a trick on Takagi, so he closed the door behind him. Takagi asked why he'd done it, and he told her he'd felt like before proceeding to drop off the balls he had with him. When it was time to leave, Nishikata tried to open the door, but it didn't work. He pulled on it a few more times and told Takagi that they were locked in, which was a lie because he'd only pretended he couldn't open the door. To his surprise, Takagi picked up a box, and when he asked what she was doing with it, she told him she wanted to tidy up the storage room. She said since they had to wait until someone came to find them, they might as well keep themselves busy. Nishikata just stared at her like she'd grown an extra head, so she asked if he was scared of the dark. He told her that he wasn't, but when the brush behind him suddenly fell, he screamed like a child. Takagi laughed at his reaction, since she was the one responsible for the brush falling. When he realized what had happened, he decided to get back at her by tying a ball to another brush. While he was doing that, he noticed Takagi had gone to lie down, so he asked why and she told him that she wanted to take a nap. As she drifted off to sleep, Nishikata continued his scaring contraption, and when he was finished, he decided to wake Takagi. Takagi, who had only been pretending to be asleep, sat up and told him that it was okay if he wanted to scare her. However, if they didn't leave soon, people would assume they were playing 7 minutes in heaven. This made the idiot panic, so he rushed to undo the contraption he created. While he was doing that, he accidentally tripped and fell, causing the brush and balls to fall on top of him. Takagi rushed over to make sure that he was fine, and he assured her that he was. He then got up and went to open the door, but hesitated because he knew that opening the door would expose his lie. Takagi told him that she already knew he'd lied about the door being locked, but chose to play his silly game. This left him feeling embarrassed, so he apologized and pulled the door, but it didn't open. He then began to panic thinking they were truly locked in this time, but Takagi pointed to the side and showed him the brush she'd used to wedge the door earlier. Nishikata couldn't believe he'd been tricked once again and stormed out of the closet, but Takagi was right behind him laughing. He did his best to ignore her since he was pissed that she'd reversed him, but she stayed by his side. When they got back to the school building, Takagi asked him to accompany her to the nurse's office. Nishikata tried to refuse, but she drew his attention to his knee, which he'd injured after he fell, and said if he didn't get it treated, it would lead to an infection. He told her it was a simple scratch that didn't require. But Takagi said he was only saying that because he was scared the antiseptic would sting. Nishikata denied it, so she asked him to prove that he wasn't scared by going to the nurse's office, and he did. When they got there, the nurse wasn't in, so Takagi offered to apply the antiseptic. She gathered the supplies and asked him to sit on the bed, but before he let her touch him, he asked her to promise that she wouldn't try to mess with him. Takagi promised she would only apply the antiseptic and nothing more, but before she cleaned the wound, she told him that if he said the word "atai," he would lose. Realizing that he was dealing with the queen of double-crossing, Nishikata decided to prove that he wasn't a cowardly wimp by staying still as she applied the antiseptic. To his surprise, it didn't hurt at all, so he relaxed and allowed Takagi to clean his wound. But Takagi wasn't ready to lose to him. She began asking him questions and tricked him into saying the word "satai." After he said it, she told him she'd won, but the clueless noob asked what she meant by that, so she told him to repeat the word. Nishikata did, and that was when he realized he'd been tricked again. She then sat beside him on the bed and said that if he wanted to win, all he had to do was hold her hand. Nishikata didn't respond, so she asked if his wound hurt, and he told her that it didn't. When he tried to return to class, Takagi told him that his punishment was to remain in the nurse's office for the rest of the day. She also added that he couldn't have lunch, making him grumble and scream into the bed. But Takagi just laughed at him and admitted that she was kidding. When he tried to stand up, he hit his knees on the bed frame, causing him to scream in pain as Takagi laughed at him again. The next day, Nishikata went to school armed with a surprise box he intended to give Takagi. However, when he got to class and greeted her, she didn't sound as enthusiastic as he hoped, making him reconsider his plans to give her the box. He decided to keep an eye on her for the rest of the day, but she didn't do anything out of the ordinary. After school, she told him goodbye and left, which was strange because she always asked him to walk home with her. As he began walking home, he felt disappointed that he hadn't given her the box because she kept to herself. He also realized that she didn't tease him once the entire day, and that made him worried. When he walked past a shrine, he noticed Takagi's bike sitting in the yard, so he went in to look for her. He found her sitting at the back, and when she saw him, she asked how he knew she'd be there. He'd explained that he'd seen her bike in the yard and asked what she was doing there instead of going home. Takagi told him she was thinking about some things, so he wondered if his presence was bothering her. In the end, he decided to leave, but accidentally dropped the box and it landed by Takagi's feet. She then picked it up, curious to know what was inside it, and before he could stop her, she opened it. What emerged was some cotton balls stuck together to resemble ice cream with sprinkles on it. Nishikata felt embarrassed, but Takagi laughed and asked if he thought some cotton balls would scare her. She also asked if he'd come looking for her just to show her his creation, and he told her no. He explained that he'd noticed she wasn't acting like her usual self, and it made him worried that something was wrong with her. Takagi laughed after hearing his explanation and told him that she'd been upset because she argued with her mother. However, she was over it and was already feeling better. She thanked him for coming to find her, and Nishikata told her it was his pleasure. He then turned to leave, but she called out to him, asking him to stay a while longer. So he moved closer to her and assumed the position of the queen's guard, which made her laugh. That night, Nishikata sat at his desk looking at the blueprints for the surprise box that he'd made, and even though it hadn't turned out the way he wanted it to, he was glad that Takagi had liked it. Just then, his phone pinged with a message from Kimura, so he picked it up to see what the ugly fatso wanted. To his surprise, the message was a butt picture, and Nishikata nearly lost his mind when he saw it. Thankfully, Kimura sent another picture, showing that the first picture was a close-up shot of his arm. Nishikata was relieved but thought it was a very silly thing to do, as it could have led to misunderstandings. However, he decided it would be a nice way to mess with Takagi, so he opened her message log with him, intending to send the picture when he received a text from her. In her text, she told him that she'd reconciled with her mother, which made him happy as he could finally tease her without feeling guilty. He immediately sent her the fake butt picture, but Takagi responded by saying she already knew what it was, so he decided to ask Kimura for help. Before he could do that, Takeji sent him another text asking if he liked steak, so he typed out a response saying he liked them. Just as he was about to hit the send button, he changed his mind as he believed the message sounded a lot like a love confession. Instead, he added the word steal at the end of the message to make his answer clearer. Takeji then sent another text asking if he liked hearts, and he responded, saying he didn't hate them, making sure that he didn't include the word heart. He soon realized she was trying to tease him, so he decided to go on the offense and ask if she liked kisses. Takeji was surprised by his question, but she didn't respond immediately, causing him to freak out as he thought he'd overstepped. When she eventually responded, it was with a video where she said she liked them, which was followed by a message stating that he was blushing. Nishikata replied, saying that he wasn't blushing, so she asked for a picture as proof. He told her that he didn't feel like taking any pictures, but Takeji had already expected him to say that, so she didn't insist. She then told him she was going to eat and said she would see him at school the next day. The next day, Nishikata was wiping down the board at the back of the class when Takeji walked into the classroom. When she saw how tired he looked, she asked if he'd spent the night watching 100% Unrequited Love. Since he didn't respond, she scolded him for neglecting his sleep and then handed him a container of eye drops to use. Nishikata thanked her for it and attempted to put it in his eyes, but each time he closed his eyes before the drops could reach his eyeballs. Takeji laughed, saying she knew he couldn't do it himself and offered to do it for him. Since everything between them was a game, she told him that if the drop entered his eye on her first try, she would win. Nishikata didn't want her to gloat about her victory, so the smartass decided the best thing to do was close his eyes until she got tired. Takeji tried to force him to open his eyes by touching his cheek with a ruler, but Nishikata stood his ground, so she poked him. Immediately, he started laughing and opened his eyes, giving Takeji the chance to put the drops in his eyes. At first, he complained that his eyes stung, but after a while, he admitted that he felt better. However, he wasn't happy that he'd lost to Takeji again, but she surprised him by asking him to put the drops in her eyes. She then took a seat and closed her eyes, waiting for him to make his move. But this moron was too busy thinking of all the things he could do to her. Takeji had to ask if he was preparing to kiss her, causing him to freak out and deny it. Eventually, he made his move, but the moment he touched her face, Yukari opened the door. When she saw the position they were in, she assumed that she'd interrupted an intimate moment, so she announced that she needed to use the bathroom and ran out. Instead of freaking out that she'd gotten the wrong idea, Takeji smiled and told Nishikata that he'd lost. This made him point out that they had bigger things to worry about. Poor Yukari ended up in the hallway, and when Hoju arrived, she asked why she wasn't going to class. Yukari said it was because Takeji and Nishikata were making out in the classroom, and she wanted to give them some privacy. Hoju was surprised, as she'd always pegged Nishikata as a prude, but Yukari assured her that he wasn't that way. She then asked Hoju if she wanted to spy on them, and Hoju agreed, since she was also curious about Takeji and Nishikata's relationship. When they got to the door, Hoju overheard the two talking, and from the little she could see, she told Yukari that they were definitely doing X-rated stuff. When Sanai and Mina arrived at school later, Yukari grabbed their hands and rushed them to the bathroom. There she told them she'd caught Takeji and Nishikata in the act, but her friends didn't take her seriously and began talking about irrelevant things like their shoe sizes. After school, Takeji and Nishikata headed home together, and when they got to Takeji's street, Nishikata bid her farewell. Takeji told him not to be in a hurry as they didn't have school the next day and tried to convince him to spend more time with her. While they were talking, she spotted a folded piece of paper, so she picked it up. When she unfolded it, she saw that it was a map, and since both of them liked the idea of finding hidden treasure, they decided to follow it. The map led them to different places until they finally found the place that was marked X. It was a large tree which had the names of a couple carved into its bark, and Takeji told Nishikata that the couple had probably had their first kiss under that tree. She said the place must have been so memorable that they created a map which she found to be romantic. Nishikata, on the other hand, didn't care for such romantic gestures and was upset that there was no hidden treasure. He then told Takeji that it was time for them to go home, but she insisted on resting under the shade of the tree for a little while. As they sat side by side under the tree, Takeji turned to face Nishikata and told him she had a question. This made him nervous as he assumed she was going to say something to mess with him, but she surprised him by asking if he wanted to listen to some music. Thankful that it wasn't something crazy, he agreed, and she gave him her earphones to put in his ear. After he put it in, she began to play cat sounds, so he ripped out the earphones and gave them back to her. Once she'd had her fill of laughter, she offered him the earphones again, promising to play regular music. Nishikata didn't believe her and refused to take the earphones, so she tricked him and put them in his ear herself. When she pressed play, he relaxed as the music was much calmer and nicer than the cat sounds she'd played earlier. A few days later, Nishikata purposely waited for Takeji on the road, but when she saw him, he acted surprised. She asked what he was doing around that area, and he told her that he'd gone for a stroll. Takeji found it strange that he chose that area to take a stroll, but he quickly changed the topic and asked if she wanted to play a game. Takagi asked what kind of game he had in mind, and he pretended to think about it before saying that whoever guessed how many steps it took to reach a nearby tree would win. Takagi told him that the tree was too close and suggested that they walk to the telephone pole instead. Nishikata acted like he was disappointed, but in truth that was his plan all along. He'd already counted the steps to the pole beforehand because he knew Takagi would choose the pole. Everything he'd done until that moment was to guarantee his victory against Takagi, and even though he knew it was cheating, he decided to do it anyway. Somehow, it seemed that Takagi figured out his plans because she suddenly asked if they could walk to the second telephone pole instead of the first one. Nishikata was shocked since he hadn't anticipated it, but agreed to go through with her plan. Before they began walking, Takagi guessed that it would take 70 steps to reach the pole, and Nishikata guessed that it would take 72. As they began walking, they counted their steps, but Takagi decided to ask Nishikata if it was a coincidence that she had run into him. He told her that it was, but she didn't believe him and asked if he'd known beforehand that she would pass that road. Nishikata denied it, however. He suddenly realized that his actions would cause him to end up on the FBI's most wanted list because his behavior was no different from that of a greatest stalker. Immediately, he tried to convince her that he hadn't known her plans beforehand and said that if they didn't finish their game, she would be late for her meeting. As soon as the words left his mouth, he recreated it as that was enough for Takagi to confirm that he had known her plans from the start. Nishikata was sure Takagi would now see him as some kind of creep, but to his surprise, she asked if he had a crush on her. She said that was the only explanation for why he had followed her, but Nishikata denied it, saying he'd only done that because he wanted to play a game against her. At the mention of their game, Takagi asked how many steps he counted, and he admitted that he couldn't remember. So she had asked if they could end the game. Nishikata agreed and Takagi began walking away, but turned around at the last second and asked what souvenir he wanted her to get him on her trip. He told her he was fine with anything, so she promised to find something he would like and left. A few weeks later, Takagi and Nishikata met at the library where they exchanged souvenirs from their various trips. Takagi's gift for Nishikata was something related to the 100% Unrequited Love series, and Nishikata's gift to Takagi was some cookies. These cookies were extremely sour, but Nishikata chose not to share that piece of information. He told her that he bought them that morning, causing her to ask if he'd returned from his trip that day. Nishikata said yes, so Takagi teased him, saying he'd missed her so much that the first thing he did after returning from his trip was to come look for her. As expected, he denied it and turned to leave, but she called out to him and asked if he wanted to stop by the shrine. After he agreed, they began walking to the shrine and he asked why she wanted to go there. She said it was because she wanted them to enjoy their souvenirs together. Nishikata was surprised by this, but after realizing that he would get to see Takagi's face, once she tasted the cookies, he smiled. As they continued walking, Takagi told him that his gift made her happy and because of that he started feeling guilty. Eventually, he couldn't handle the guilt anymore and admitted that he bought the cookies to prank her. He revealed they were sour, and she told him that she didn't mind eating them as long as he tasted them first. At the shrine, they ate the sour cookies together, but Nishikata was the only one who complained about the taste. After eating their cookies, Takagi asked Nishikata if he would attend the summer festival with anyone, and he said he wasn't sure. She told him that she wanted to attend the festival and said she wouldn't mind if someone asked her to go with them. Of course, she was hinting at the fact that she wanted him to ask her to the festival, but Nishikata was too dense to realize that. A few days later, Nishikata ran into Takagi while he was out riding his bike. She had a couple of shopping bags with her, so he offered to help her carry them with his bike. As they walked to her place, Takagi asked Nishikata if he'd done his homework, and he said he hadn't. She then suggested that they meet at the library the next day to work on their homework together. After he agreed, he attempted to ask if she'd go to the festival with him, but because he was nervous, he changed his mind. When they arrived at her house, Takagi thanked him for helping her and asked if he wanted to come inside. He told her that he couldn't because he had plans with his friends, so she gave him a can of soda to show her appreciation. Nishikata thanked her for the drink and then rode away on his bike, but a few seconds later, he returned and nervously asked if she would go to the festival with him. Takagi told him yes and happily handed him a few more sodas. Her reaction and answer surprised him so much that while he was fishing with his friends, he kept thinking about it and didn't pay attention to anything his friends did or said. On the day of the festival, Nishikata met Takagi in front of the candy shop, so they could go to the festival together. Takagi was dressed in a yukata and apologized for running late, but he assured her that he didn't mind. On their way to the festival, she told her that she'd met Mono on her way to meet him, and Mono had informed her that she and Nakai were also going on a date. The word also caught Nishikata's attention, so he asked what she meant by that, and she told him that they were on a date. Nishikata assured her that they weren't on a date, but some kids ran up to them, saying they were a couple out on a date. After the kids ran off, Nishikata told Takagi not to listen to their childish nonsense, but she insisted that anyone who saw them would think they were on a date. Still, he said they were wrong. So she suggested that they make a game out of it and said that if anyone else said they were on a date, he would lose. Determined to prove her wrong, Nishikata agreed even though he knew she was only trying to find ways to tease him. Just then, an old couple walked past them and said they were a cute pair of young lovebirds. Takagi laughed at this, but Nishikata argued that it didn't count as they had used the term lovebirds. When they got to the festival, they stopped by a stall to buy some candy apples, and the owner called them a couple. Takagi then told Nishikata that if they ended up doing things that real couples did on a date, she would count it as his win. As they walked around, Nishikata couldn't help but notice the couples around them. Each one of them did something that normal couples did, and he began freaking out because he couldn't imagine himself doing the same things with Takagi. Hoping to get out of the game, Nishikata challenged Takagi to a game of catching goldfish. He told her that if he won her game, would be declared null and void, but luck wasn't on his side and he lost the game. After the game, they got some food, and while they were eating, Takagi tried to get Nishikata to feed her, but he refused to give in as it was too romantic for him. This made her tease him and say that if he wanted to cancel her game, he had to beat her in another game. Eventually, they chose the ring-tossing game, and while they were playing, Nishikata was sure he'd win. Unfortunately, just as he was about to toss the final ring, their teacher suddenly appeared behind him and told him not to stay out late. Startled by the man's appearance, Nishikata missed his shot and lost the game. After they collected their prizes, Nishikata gave his own to Takagi since it was a hairpin, and she gave him hers because it was a cyborg mask. They then continued walking around the festival, but the place was becoming crowded. Nishikata noticed a couple holding hands and became flustered when Takagi raised her hand because he thought she was going to hold his hand. Instead, she told him that the mask suited him and continued walking as he put the mask on to hide his face. Before he could go after Takagi, he spotted Takao and Kimura, who recognized him even though he had the mask on. While they were talking to him, Kimura noticed he was holding Takagi's bag, so he dragged Takao away, saying he was hungry. After they left, Nishikata looked around, hoping to find Takagi, but realized he'd lost sight of her. Simultaneously, Takagi also realized that she'd gotten separated from Nishikata, so she started looking for him. As the fireworks display began, Takagi climbed up to the shrine, hoping to find Takagi there. Kimura happened to spot her, and when he noticed Nishikata running around like a headless chicken, he realized he was searching for Takagi, so he let him know where she was. Immediately, Nishikata rushed to the shrine and met Takagi on the steps, so he grabbed her hand and told her it was to make sure they didn't get separated again. Since they missed the fireworks display, they went down to the beach to light some sparklers. While they were there, Takagi told Nishikata that they looked like they were on a real date. Nishikata told her that he'd only bought the sparklers because he was hoping to beat her in a game since he'd been losing all their games. Takagi just smiled and assured him that he hadn't been losing at all, which surprised him. However, when the light on his sparkler went out, she told him she'd won, causing him to shriek. That's all for today's video. However, do you think Nishikata and Takagi would admit they have feelings for one another? If you want to find out, let us know by commenting more. Also, check out this video if you like recaps like this.